Chapter 35 of The Custom of the Country by Edith Wharton. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Within 48 hours, Ralph's money was in Moffatt's hands, and the interval of suspense had begun. The transaction over, he felt the deceptive buoyancy that follows on periods of painful indecision. It seemed to him that now at last life had freed him from all trammelling delusions, leaving him only the best thing in its gift, his boy. The things he meant Paul to do and to be filled his fancy with happy pictures. The child was growing more and more interesting, throwing out countless tendrils of feeling and perception that delighted Ralph but preoccupied the watchful Laura. "He's going to be exactly like you, Ralph." She paused, and then risked it. "For his own sake, I wish there were just a drop or two of Spragg in him." Ralph laughed, understanding her. "Oh, the plodding citizen I've become will keep him from taking after the lyric idiot who begot him. Paul and I, between us, are going to turn out something first rate." His book, too, was spreading and throwing out tendrils, and he worked at it in the white heat of energy which his factitious exhilaration produced. For a few weeks everything he did and said seemed as easy and unconditioned as the actions in a dream. Claire Van Degen, in the light of this mood, became again the comrade of his boyhood. He did not see her often, for she had gone down to the country with her children, but they communicated daily by letter or telephone, and now and then she came over to the Fairfords for a night. There they renewed the long rambles of their youth, and once more the summer fields and woods seemed full of magic presences. Claire was no more intelligent, she followed him no further in his flights, but some of the qualities that had become most precious to him were as native to her as its perfume to a flower. So, through the long June afternoons, they ranged together over many themes, and if her answers sometimes missed the mark, it did not matter, because her silences never did. Meanwhile Ralph, from various sources, continued to pick up a good deal of more or less contradictory information about Elmer Moffatt. It seemed to be generally understood that Moffatt had come back from Europe with the intention of testifying in the Ararat investigation, and that his former patron, the great Harmon B. Driscoll, had managed to silence him, and it was implied that the price of this silence, which was set at a considerable figure, had been turned to account in a series of speculations likely to lift Moffatt to permanent eminence among the rulers of Wall Street. The stories as to his latest achievement, and the theories as to the man himself, varied with the visual angle of each reporter, and whenever any attempt was made to focus his hard, sharp personality, some guardian divinity seemed to throw a veil of mystery over him. His detractors, however, were the first to own that there was something about him. It was felt that he had passed beyond the meteoric stage, and the business world was unanimous in recognizing that he had come to stay. A dawning sense of his stability was even beginning to make itself felt in Fifth Avenue. It was said that he had bought a house in 72nd Street, then that he meant to build near the Park. One or two people, always taken by a friend, had been to his flat in the Pactolus to see his Chinese porcelains and Persian rugs. Now and then he had a few important men to dine at a Fifth Avenue restaurant. His name began to appear in philanthropic reports and on municipal committees. There were even rumors of its having been put up at a well-known club. And the rector of a wealthy parish, who was raising funds for a chantry, was known to have met him at dinner and to have stated afterward that "the man was not wholly a materialist." All these converging proofs of Moffatt's solidity strengthened Ralph's faith in his venture. He remembered with what astuteness and authority Moffatt had conducted their real estate transaction, how far off and unreal it all seemed, and awaited events with the passive faith of a sufferer in the hands of a skilful surgeon. The days moved on toward the end of June, and each morning Ralph opened his newspaper with a keener thrill of expectation. Any day now he might read of the granting of the Apex Charter. Moffatt had assured him it would go through before the close of the month. But the announcement did not appear, and after what seemed to Ralph a decent lapse of time, he telephoned to ask for news. Moffatt was away, and when he came back a few days later he answered Ralph's enquiries evasively, with an edge of irritation in his voice. The same day Ralph received a letter from his lawyer, who had been reminded by Mrs. Marvell's representatives that the latest date agreed on for the execution of the financial agreement was the end of the following week. Ralph, alarmed, betook himself at once to the Ararat, and his first glimpse of Moffatt's round common face and fastidiously dressed person gave him an immediate sense of reassurance. He felt that under the circle of baldness on top of that carefully brushed head lay the solution of every monetary problem that could beset the soul of man. Moffatt's voice had recovered its usual cordial note, and the warmth of his welcome dispelled Ralph's last apprehension.
Why, yes, everything's going along first rate. They thought they'd hung us up last week, but they haven't. There may be another week's delay, but we ought to be opening a bottle of wine on it by the 4th.
An office boy came in with a name on a slip of paper, and Moffatt looked at his watch and held out a hearty hand.
Glad you came. Of course I'll keep you posted. No, this way. Look in again.
And he steered Ralph out by another door. July came and passed into its second week. Ralph's lawyer had obtained a postponement from the other side, but Undine's representatives had given him to understand that the transaction must be closed before the 1st of August. Ralph telephoned once or twice to Moffatt, receiving genially worded assurances that everything was going their way, but he felt a certain embarrassment in returning again to the office, and let himself drift through the days in a state of hungry apprehension. Finally, one afternoon, Henley Fairford, coming back from town, which Ralph had left in the morning to join his boy over Sunday, brought word that the Apex Consolidation Scheme had failed to get its charter. It was useless to attempt to reach Moffatt on Sunday, and Ralph wore on as he could through the succeeding 24 hours. Claire Van Degen had come down to stay with her youngest boy, and in the afternoon she and Ralph took the two children for a sail. A light breeze brightened the waters of the Sound, and they ran down the shore before it and then tacked out toward the sunset, coming back at last under a failing breeze, as the summer sky passed from blue to a translucid green and then into the accumulating grays of twilight. As they left the landing and walked up behind the children across the darkening lawn, a sense of security descended again on Ralph. He could not believe that such a scene and such a mood could be the disguise of any impending evil, and all his doubts and anxieties fell away from him. The next morning he and Claire travelled up to town together, and at the station he put her in the motor which was to take her to Long Island, and hastened down to Moffatt's office. When he arrived he was told that Moffatt was engaged, and he had to wait for nearly half an hour in the outer office, where, to the steady click of the typewriter and the spasmodic buzzing of the telephone, his thoughts again began their restless circlings. Finally the inner door opened, and he found himself in the sanctuary. Moffatt was seated behind his desk, examining another little crystal vase somewhat like the one he had shown Ralph a few weeks earlier. As his visitor entered, he held it up against the light, revealing on its dewy sides an incised design as frail as the shadow of grass-blades on water.
Ain't she a peach?
He put the toy down and reached across the desk to shake hands.
Well, well,
he went on, leaning back in his chair and pushing out his lower lip in a half-comic pout.
they've got us in the neck this time, and no mistake. Seen this morning's radiator? I don't know how the thing leaked out, but the reformers somehow got a smell of the scheme, and whenever they get swishing round something's bound to get spilt.
He talked gaily, genially, in his roundest tones and with his easiest gestures. Never had he conveyed a completer sense of unhurried power. But Ralph noticed for the first time the crow's feet about his eyes, and the sharpness of the contrast between the white of his forehead and the redness of the fold of neck above his collar.
Do you mean to say it's not going through? Not this time, anyhow. We're high and dry.
Something seemed to snap in Ralph's head, and he sat down in the nearest chair.
Has the common stock dropped a lot? Well, you've got to lean over to see it.
Moffatt pressed his fingertips together, and added thoughtfully,
But it's there, all right. We're bound to get our charter in the end.
What do you call the end?
Oh, before the Day of Judgment, sure. Next year, I guess.
Next year? Ralph flushed. What earthly good will that do me?
I don't say it's as pleasant as driving your best girl home by moonlight, but that's how it is. And the stuff's safe enough anyway. I've told you that right along."
"But you've told me all along I could count on a rise before August. You knew I had to have the money now."
I knew you wanted to have the money now, and so did I, and several of my friends. I put you onto it because it was the only thing in sight likely to give you the return you wanted."
"You ought at least to have warned me of the risk."
Risk? I don't call it much of a risk to lie back in your chair and wait another few months for 50,000 to drop into your lap. I tell you the thing's as safe as a bank."
"How do I know it is? You've misled me about it from the first." Moffatt's face grew dark red to the forehead. For the first time in their acquaintance, Ralph saw him on the verge of anger.
"Well, if you get stuck, so do I. I'm in it a good deal deeper than you. That's about the best guarantee I can give. Unless you won't take my word for that, either."
To control himself, Moffatt spoke with extreme deliberation, separating his syllables like a machine cutting something into even lengths. Ralph listened through a cloud of confusion. But he saw the madness of offending Moffatt, and tried to take a more conciliatory tone.
"Of course I take your word for it. But I simply can't afford to lose." "You ain't going to lose. I don't believe you'll even have to put up any margin. It's there, safe enough, I tell you."
Yes, yes, I understand. I'm sure you wouldn't have advised me." Ralph's tongue seemed swollen, and he had difficulty in bringing out the words. "Only, you see, I can't wait. It's not possible, and I want to know if there isn't a way—" Moffatt looked at him with a sort of resigned compassion, as a doctor looks at a despairing mother who will not understand what he has tried to imply without uttering the word she dreads. Ralph understood the look, but hurried on. "You'll think I'm mad, or an ass, to talk like this. But the fact is, I must have the money." He waited, and drew a hard breath. "I must have it. That's all. Perhaps I'd better tell you." Moffatt, who had risen, as if assuming that the interview was over, sat down again and turned an attentive look on him.
"Go ahead,"
he said, more humanly than he had hitherto spoken.
"My boy. You spoke of him the other day. I'm awfully fond of him."
Ralph broke off, deterred by the impossibility of confiding his feeling for Paul to this coarse-grained man with whom he hadn't a sentiment in common. Moffatt was still looking at him.
"I should say you would be. He's as smart a little chap as I ever saw. And I guess he's the kind that gets better every day."
Ralph had collected himself and went on with sudden resolution. "Well, you see, when my wife and I separated, I never dreamed she'd want the boy. The question never came up. If it had, of course. But she'd left him with me when she went away 2 years before, and at the time of the divorce I was a fool. I didn't take the proper steps."
"You mean she's got sole custody?"
Ralph made a sign of assent, and Moffatt pondered.
"That's bad. Bad."
"And now I understand she's going to marry again. And of course I can't give up my son."
"She wants you to, eh?"
Ralph again assented. Moffatt swung his chair about and leaned back in it, stretching out his plump legs and contemplating the tips of his varnished boots. He hummed a low tune behind inscrutable lips.
"That's what you want the money for?"
he finally raised his head to ask. The word came out of the depths of Ralph's anguish. "Yes."
"And why you want it in such a hurry? I see."
Moffatt reverted to the study of his boots.
"It's a lot of money."
"Yes, that's the difficulty. And she—" Ralph's tongue was again too thick for his mouth. "I'm afraid she won't wait. Or take less." Moffatt, abandoning the boots, was scrutinizing him through half-shut lids.
"No,"
he said slowly.
"I don't believe Undine Spragg will take a single cent less."
Ralph felt himself whiten. Was it insolence or ignorance that had prompted Moffatt's speech? Nothing in his voice or face showed the sense of any shades of expression or of feeling. He seemed to apply to everything the measure of the same crude flippancy. but such considerations could not curb Ralph now. He said to himself, "Keep your temper. Keep your temper." And his anger suddenly boiled over. "Look here, Moffatt," he said, getting to his feet. "The fact that I've been divorced from Mrs. Marvell doesn't authorize anyone to take that tone to me in speaking of her." Moffatt met the challenge with a calm stare, under which there were dawning signs of surprise and interest. "That's so? Well, if that's the case, I presume I ought to feel the same way. I've been divorced from her myself." For an instant the words conveyed no meaning to Ralph. Then they surged up into his brain and flung him forward with half-raised arm. But he felt the grotesqueness of the gesture, and his arm dropped back to his side. A series of unimportant and irrelevant things raced through his mind. Then obscurity settled down on it. This man, was the one fiery point in his darkened consciousness. "What on earth are you talking about?" he brought out. "Why, facts," said Moffatt, in a cool, half-humorous voice. "You didn't know? I understood from Mrs. Marvell your folks had a prejudice against divorce, so I suppose she kept quiet about that early episode. The truth is," he continued amicably, "I wouldn't have alluded to it now if you hadn't taken a rather high tone with me about our little venture. But now it's out, I guess you may as well hear the whole story. It's mighty wholesome for a man to have a round now and then with a few facts. Shall I go on?" Ralph had stood listening without a sign, but as Moffatt ended he made a slight motion of acquiescence. He did not otherwise change his attitude, except to grasp with one hand the back of the chair that Moffatt pushed toward him. "Rather stand?" Moffatt himself dropped back into his seat, and took the pose of easy narrative. "Well, it was this way. Undine Spragg and I were made one at Opake, Nebraska, just 9 years ago last month. My, she was a beauty then. Nothing much had happened to her before but being engaged for a year or two to a soft called Millard Binch, the same she passed on to Indiana Rolliver. And, well, I guess she liked the change. We didn't have what you'd call a society wedding. No best man or bridesmaids or voice that breathed or Eden. Fact is, Pa and Ma didn't know about it till it was over. But it was a marriage fast enough, as they found out when they tried to undo it. Trouble was they caught on too soon. We only had a fortnight. Then they hauled Undine back to Apex and, well, I hadn't the cash or the pull to fight 'em. Uncle Abner was a pretty big man out there then, and he had James J. Rolliver behind him. I always know when I'm licked, and I was licked that time. So we unlooped the loop and they fixed it up for me to make a trip to Alaska. Let me see, that was the year before they moved over to New York. Next time I saw Undine, I sat alongside of her at the theatre that day your engagement was announced." He still kept to his half-humorous minor key, as though he were in the first stages of an after-dinner speech, but as he went on, his bodily presence, which hitherto had seemed to Ralph the mere average garment of vulgarity, began to loom, huge and portentous, as some monster released from a magician's bottle. His redness, his glossiness, his baldness, and the carefully brushed ring of hair encircling it, the square line of his shoulders, the too careful fit of his clothes, the prominent lustre of his scarf-pin, the growth of short black hair on his manicured hands, even the tiny cracks and crow's feet beginning to show in the hard, close surface of his complexion, all these solid witnesses to his reality and his proximity pressed on Ralph with the mounting pang of physical nausea. This man! This man! He couldn't get beyond the thought. Whichever way he turned his haggard thought, there was Moffatt bodily blocking the perspective. Ralph's eyes roamed toward the crystal toy that stood on the desk beside Moffatt's hand. Faugh! That such a hand should have touched it. Suddenly he heard himself speaking. "Before my marriage. Did you know they hadn't told me?" "Why, I understood as much." Ralph pushed on. "You knew it the day that I met you in Mr. Spragg's office?" Moffatt considered a moment, as if the incident had escaped him. "Did we meet there?" He seemed benevolently ready for enlightenment. But Ralph had been assailed by another memory. He recalled that Moffatt had dined one night in his house, that he and the man who now faced him had sat at the same table, their wife between them. He was seized with another dumb gust of fury, but it died out and left him face to face with the uselessness, the irrelevance of all the old attitudes of appropriation and defiance. He seemed to be stumbling about in his inherited prejudices like a modern man in medieval armor. Moffatt still sat at his desk, unmoved and apparently uncomprehending. "He doesn't even know what I'm feeling," flashed through Ralph, and the whole archaic structure of his rights and sanctions tumbled down about him. Through the noise of the crash he heard Moffatt's voice going on without perceptible change of tone. "About that other matter now. You can't feel any meaner about it than I do, I can tell you that. But all we've got to do is to sit tight." Ralph turned from the voice, and found himself outside on the landing, and then in the street below. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Custom of the Country by Edith Wharton. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. He stood at the corner of Wall Street, looking up and down its hot summer perspective. He noticed the swirls of dust in the cracks of the pavement, the rubbish in the gutters, the ceaseless stream of perspiring faces that poured by under tilted hats. He found himself next slipping northward between the glazed walls of the subway, another languid crowd in the seats about him, and the nasal yelp of the stations ringing through the car like some repeated ritual wail. The blindness within him seemed to have intensified his physical perceptions, his sensitiveness to the heat, the noise, the smells of the dishevelled midsummer city; but combined with the acuter perception of these offences was a complete indifference to them, as though he were some vivisected animal deprived of the power of discrimination. Now he had turned into Waverley Place, and was walking westward toward Washington Square. At the corner he pulled himself up, saying half aloud, "The office. I ought to be at the office." He drew out his watch and stared at it blankly. What the devil had he taken it out for? He had to go through a laborious process of readjustment to find out what it had to say. 12 o'clock. Should he turn back to the office? It seemed easier to cross the square, go up the steps of the old house, and slip his key into the door. The house was empty. His mother, a few days previously, had departed with Mr. Dagonet for their usual 2 months on the Maine coast, where Ralph was to join them with his boy. The blinds were all drawn down, and the freshness and silence of the marble-paved hall laid soothing hands on him. He said to himself, "I'll jump into a cab presently, and go and lunch at the club." He laid down his hat and stick and climbed the carpetless stairs to his room. When he entered it he had the shock of feeling himself in a strange place. It did not seem like anything he had ever seen before. Then, one by one, all the old, stale, usual things in it confronted him, and he longed with a sick intensity to be in a place that was really strange. "How on earth can I go on living here?" he wondered. A careless servant had left the outer shutters open, and the sun was beating on the window panes. Ralph pushed open the windows, shut the shutters, and wandered toward his armchair. Beads of perspiration stood on his forehead. The temperature of the room reminded him of the heat under the ilexes of the Sienese villa where he and Undine had sat through a long July afternoon. He saw her before him, leaning against the tree-trunk in her white dress, limpid and inscrutable. We were made one at opaque Nebraska. Had she been thinking of it that afternoon at Siena, he wondered? Did she ever think of it at all? It was she who had asked Moffatt to dine. She had said, "Father brought him home one day at Apex. I don't remember ever having seen him since." And the man she spoke of had had her in his arms. And perhaps it really was all she remembered. She had lied to him from the first. There hadn't been a moment when she hadn't lied to him, deliberately, ingeniously, and inventively. As he thought of it, there came to him, for the first time in months, that overwhelming sense of her physical nearness which had once so haunted and tortured him. her freshness, her fragrance, the luminous haze of her youth filled the room with a mocking glory, and he dropped his head on his hands to shut it out. The vision was swept away by another wave of hurrying thoughts. He felt it was intensely important that he should keep the thread of every one of them, that they all represented things to be said or done or guarded against, and his mind, with the unwondering versatility and tireless haste of the dreamer's brain, seemed to be pursuing them all simultaneously. Then they became as unreal and meaningless as the red specks dancing behind the lids, against which he had pressed his fists clenched, and he had the feeling that if he opened his eyes they would vanish, and the familiar daylight look in on him. A knock disturbed him. The old parlour-maid, who was always left in charge of the house, had come up to ask if he wasn't well, and if there was anything she could do for him. He told her no, he was perfectly well. Or rather, no, he wasn't. He supposed it must be the heat, and he began to scold her for having forgotten to close the shutters. It wasn't her fault, it appeared, but Eliza's. Her tone implied that he knew what one had to expect of Eliza, and wouldn't he go down to the nice, cool, shady dining-room and let her make him an iced drink and a few sandwiches? "I've always told Mrs. Marvell I couldn't turn my back for a second but what Eliza'd find a way to make trouble," the old woman continued, evidently glad of the chance to air a perennial grievance. "It's not only the things she forgets to do," she added significantly, and it dawned on Ralph that she was making an appeal to him, expecting him to take sides with her in the chronic conflict between herself and Eliza. He said to himself that perhaps she was right, that perhaps there was something he ought to do, that his mother was old and didn't always see things, and for a while his mind revolved this problem with feverish intensity. "Then you'll come down, sir?"
Yes.
The door closed, and he heard her heavy heels along the passage.
But the money. Where's the money to come from?
The question sprang out from some denser fold of the fog in his brain. The money. How on earth was he to pay it back? How could he have wasted his time in thinking of anything else while that central difficulty existed?
But I can't. I can't. It's gone. And even if it weren't.
He dropped back in his chair and took his head between his hands. He had forgotten what he wanted the money for. He made a great effort to regain hold of the idea, but all the whirring, shuttling, flying had abruptly ceased in his brain, and he sat with his eyes shut, staring straight into darkness. The clock struck, and he remembered that he had said he would go down to the dining-room.
If I don't, she'll come up.
He raised his head, and sat listening for the sound of the old woman's step. It seemed to him perfectly intolerable that any one should cross the threshold of the room again.
Why can't they leave me alone? He groaned.
At length, through the silence of the empty house, he fancied he heard a door opening and closing far below, and he said to himself,
She's coming.
He got to his feet and went to the door. He didn't feel anything now except the insane dread of hearing the woman's steps come nearer. He bolted the door and stood looking about the room. For a moment he was conscious of seeing it in every detail with a distinctness he had never before known. Then everything in it vanished but the single narrow panel of a drawer under one of the bookcases. He went up to the drawer, knelt down, and slipped his hand into it. As he raised himself he listened again, and this time he distinctly heard the old servant's steps on the stairs. He passed his left hand over the side of his head and down the curve of the skull behind the ear. He said to himself,
My wife. This will make it all right for her.
And a last flash of irony twitched through him. Then he felt again, more deliberately, for the spot he wanted, and put the muzzle of his revolver against it. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Custom of the Country, by Edith Wharton. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. In a drawing-room hung with portraits of high-nosed personages and perukes and orders, a circle of ladies and gentlemen, looking not unlike everyday versions of the official figures above their heads, sat examining with friendly interest a little boy in mourning. The boy was slim, fair, and shy, and his small black figure, islanded in the middle of the wide, lustrous floor, looked curiously lonely and remote. This effect of remoteness seemed to strike his mother as something intentional and almost naughty, for after having launched him from the door, and waited to judge of the impression he produced, she came forward, and giving him a slight push, said impatiently, "Paul, why don't you go and kiss your new granny?" The boy, without turning to her or moving, sent his blue glance gravely about the circle. "Does she want me to?" he asked, in a tone of evident apprehension, and on his mother's answering, "Of course, you silly," he added earnestly, "How many more do you think there'll be?" Undine blushed to the ripples of her brilliant hair. "I never knew such a child. They've turned him into a perfect little savage." Raymond de Chelles advanced from behind his mother's chair. "He won't be a savage long with me," he said, stooping down so that his fatigued, finely drawn face was close to Paul's. Their eyes met, and the boy smiled. "Come along, old chap," Chelles continued in English, drawing the little boy after him. "Il est bien beau," the Marquise de Chelles observed, her eyes turning from Paul's grave face to her daughter-in-law's vivid countenance. "Do be nice, darling. Say, 'Bonjour, madame,'" Undine urged. An odd mingling of emotions stirred in her while she stood watching Paul make the round of the family group under her husband's guidance. It was lovely to have the child back, and to find him, after their 3 years' separation, grown into so endearing a figure. Her first glimpse of him when in Mrs. Heeny's arms he had emerged that morning from the steamer train had shown what an acquisition he would be. If she had had any lingering doubts on the point, the impression produced on her husband would have dispelled them. Chelles had been instantly charmed, and Paul, in a shy, confused way, was already responding to his advances. The Count and Countess Raymond had returned but a few weeks before from their protracted wedding journey, and were staying, as they were apparently to do whenever they came to Paris, with the old Marquis, Raymond's father, who had amicably proposed that little Paul Marvell should also share the hospitality of the Hôtel de Chelles. Undine at first was somewhat dismayed to find that she was expected to fit the boy and his nurse into a corner of her contracted entresol. But the possibility of a mother's not finding room for her son, however cramped her own quarters, seemed not to have occurred to her new relations, and the preparing of her dressing-room and boudoir for Paul's occupancy was carried on by the household with a zeal which obliged her to dissemble her lukewarmness. Undine had supposed that on her marriage one of the great suites of the Hôtel de Chelles would be emptied of its tenants and put at her husband's disposal, but she had since learned that, even had such a plan occurred to her parents-in-law, considerations of economy would have hindered it. The old Marquis and his wife, who were content when they came up from Burgundy in the spring with a modest set of rooms looking out on the court of their ancestral residence, expected their son and his wife to fit themselves into the still smaller apartment which had served as Raymond's bachelor lodging. The rest of the fine old mouldering house, the tall windowed première on the garden and the whole of the floor above, had been let for years to old-fashioned tenants who would have been more surprised than their landlord had he suddenly proposed to dispossess them. Undine at first had regarded these arrangements as merely provisional. She was persuaded that under her influence Raymond would soon convert his parents to more modern ideas, and meanwhile she was still in the flush of a completer well-being than she had ever known, and disposed for the moment to make light of any inconveniences connected with it. The 3 months since her marriage had been more nearly like what she had dreamed of than any of her previous experiments in happiness. At last she had got what she wanted, and for the first time the glow of triumph was warmed by a deeper feeling. Her husband was really charming. It was odd how he reminded her of Ralph. And after her bitter 2 years of loneliness and humiliation, it was delicious to find herself once more adored and protected. The very fact that Raymond was more jealous of her than Ralph had ever been, or at any rate less reluctant to show it, gave her a keener sense of recovered power. None of the men who had been in love with her before had been so frankly possessive, or so eager for reciprocal assurances of constancy. She knew that Ralph had suffered deeply from her intimacy with Van Degen, but he had betrayed his feeling only by a more studied detachment, and Van Degen from the first had been contemptuously indifferent to what she did or felt when she was out of his sight. As to her earlier experiences, she had frankly forgotten them. Her sentimental memories went back no farther than the beginning of her New York career. Raymond seemed to attach more importance to love, in all its manifestations, than was usual or convenient in a husband, and she gradually began to be aware that her domination over him involved a corresponding loss of independence. Since their return to Paris she had found that she was expected to give a circumstantial report of every hour she spent away from him. She had nothing to hide, and no designs against his peace of mind except those connected with her frequent and costly sessions at the dressmaker's, but she had never before been called upon to account to any one for the use of her time, and after the first amused surprise at Raymond's always wanting to know where she had been and whom she had seen, she began to be oppressed by so exacting a devotion. Her parents, from her tenderest youth, had tacitly recognized her inalienable right to go around, and Ralph, though from motives which she divined to be different, had shown the same respect for her freedom. It was therefore disconcerting to find that Raymond expected her to choose her friends, and even her acquaintances, in conformity not only with his personal tastes, but with a definite and complicated code of family prejudices and traditions, and she was especially surprised to discover that he viewed with disapproval her intimacy with the Princess Estradina. "My cousin's extremely amusing, of course, but utterly mad, and very mal entourée. Most of the people she has about her ought to be in prison or Bedlam, especially that unspeakable Madame Adolpschein, who's a candidate for both. My aunt's an angel, but she's been weak enough to let Lily turn the Hôtel de Dordogne into an annex of Montmartre. Of course you'll have to show yourself there now and then. In these days families like ours must hold together. But go to the réunion de famille rather than to Lily's intimate parties. Go with me or my mother. Don't let yourself be seen there alone. You're too young and good-looking to be mixed up with that crew. A woman's classed, or rather unclassed, by being known as one of Lily's set." Agreeable as it was to Undine that an appeal to her discretion should be based on the ground of her youth and good looks, she was dismayed to find herself cut off from the very circle she had meant them to establish her in. Before she had become Raymond's wife there had been a moment of sharp tension in her relations with the Princess Estradina and the old Duchess. They had done their best to prevent her marrying their cousin, and had gone so far as openly to accuse her of being the cause of a breach between themselves and his parents. But Ralph Marvell's death had brought about a sudden change in her situation. She was now no longer a divorced woman struggling to obtain ecclesiastical sanction for her remarriage, but a widow whose conspicuous beauty and independent situation made her the object of lawful aspirations. The first person to seize on this distinction and make the most of it was her old enemy, the Marquise de Trezac. The latter, who had been loudly charged by the house of Chelles with furthering her beautiful compatriot's designs, had instantly seen a chance of vindicating herself by taking the widowed Mrs. Marvell under her wing and favouring the attentions of other suitors. These were not lacking, and the expected result had followed. Raymond de Chelles, more than ever infatuated as attainment became less certain, had claimed a definite promise from Undine, and his family, discouraged by his persistent bachelorhood and their failure to fix his attention on any of the amiable maidens obviously designed to continue the race, had ended by withdrawing their opposition, and discovering in Mrs. Marvell the moral and financial merits necessary to justify their change of front. "A good match? If she isn't, I should like to know what the Chelles call one," Madame de Trezac went about indefatigably proclaiming. "Related to the best people in New York, well, by marriage, that is, and her husband left much more money than was expected. It goes to the boy, of course, but as the boy is with his mother, she naturally enjoys the income. And her father's a rich man, much richer than is generally known. I mean what we call rich in America, you understand." Madame de Trezac had lately discovered that the proper attitude for the American married abroad was that of a militant patriotism, and she flaunted Undine Marvell in the face of the faubourg like a particularly showy specimen of her national banner. The success of the experiment emboldened her to throw off the most sacred observances of her past. She took up Madame Adolpschein, she entertained the James J. Rollivers, she resuscitated Creole dishes, she patronized Negro melodists, and abandoned her weekly teas for impromptu afternoon dances, and the prim drawing-room in which dowagers had droned echoed with a cosmopolitan hubbub. Even when the period of tension was over, and Undine had been officially received into the family of her betrothed, Madame de Trezac did not at once surrender. She laughingly professed to have had enough of the proprieties, and declared herself bored by the social rites she had hitherto so piously performed. "You'll always find a corner of home here, dearest, when you get tired of their ceremonies and solemnities," she said, as she embraced the bride after the wedding breakfast, and Undine hoped that the devoted Nettie would in fact provide a refuge from the extreme domesticity of her new state. But since her return to Paris, and her taking up her domicile in the Hôtel de Chelles, she had found Madame de Trezac less and less disposed to abet her in any assertion of independence. "My dear, a woman must adopt her husband's nationality whether she wants to or not. It's the law, and it's the custom besides. If you wanted to amuse yourself with your Nouveau Luxe friends, you oughtn't to have married Raymond. But of course I say that only in joke. As if any woman would have hesitated who'd had your chance. Take my advice. Keep out of Lily's set just at first. Later, well, perhaps Raymond won't be so particular. But meanwhile you'd make a great mistake to go against his people." And Madame de Trezac, with a "Chère Madame," swept forward from her tea-table to receive the first of the returning dowagers. It was about this time that Mrs. Heeny arrived with Paul, and for a while Undine was pleasantly absorbed in her boy. She kept Mrs. Heeny in Paris for a fortnight, and between her more pressing occupations it amused her to listen to the masseuse's New York gossip and her comments on the social organization of the Old World. It was Mrs. Heeny's first visit to Europe, and she confessed to Undine that she had always wanted to see something of the aristocracy, using the phrase as a naturalist might, with no hint of personal pretensions. Mrs. Heeny's democratic ease was combined with the strictest professional discretion, and it would never have occurred to her to regard herself, or to wish others to regard her, as anything but a manipulator of muscles. But in that character she felt herself entitled to admission to the highest circles.
They certainly do things with style over here, but it's kinder one horse after New York, ain't it? Is this what they call their season? Why, you dined home 2 nights last week. They ought to come over to New York and see."
And she poured into Undine's half-envious ear a list of the entertainments which had illuminated the last weeks of the New York winter.
"I suppose you'll begin to give parties as soon as ever you get into a house of your own. You're not going to have one? Oh, well, then you'll give a lot of big weekends at your place down in the Shatter country. That's where the swells all go to in the summer time, ain't it? But I don't know what your ma would say if she knew you were going to live on with his folks after you're done honeymooning. Why, we read in the papers you were going to live in some grand hotel or other." "Oh, they call their houses hotels, do they? That's funny. I suppose it's because they let out part of 'em. Well, you look handsomer than ever, Undine. I'll take that back to your mother anyhow. And he's dead in love, I can see that. Reminds me of the way—"
But she broke off suddenly, as if something in Undine's look had silenced her. Even to herself, Undine did not like to call up the image of Ralph Marvell, and any mention of his name gave her a vague sense of distress. His death had released her, had given her what she wanted, yet she could honestly say to herself that she had not wanted him to die, at least not to die like that. People said at the time that it was the hot weather; his own family had said so. He had never quite got over his attack of pneumonia, and the sudden rise of temperature, one of the fierce heat waves that devastate New York in summer, had probably affected his brain. The doctors said such cases were not uncommon. She had worn black for a few weeks, not quite mourning, but something decently regretful. The dressmakers were beginning to provide a special garb for such cases. And even since her remarriage and the lapse of a year, she continued to wish that she could have got what she wanted without having had to pay that particular price for it. This feeling was intensified by an incident, in itself far from unwelcome, which had occurred about 3 months after Ralph's death. Her lawyers had written to say that the sum of $100,000 had been paid over to Marvell's estate by the Apex Consolidation Company, and as Marvell had left a will bequeathing everything he possessed to his son, this unexpected windfall handsomely increased Paul's patrimony. Undine had never relinquished her claim on her child. She had merely, by the advice of her lawyers, waived the assertion of her right for a few months after Marvell's death, with the express stipulation that her doing so was only a temporary concession to the feelings of her husband's family. and she had held out against all attempts to induce her to surrender Paul permanently. Before her marriage she had somewhat conspicuously adopted her husband's creed, and the Dagonets, picturing Paul as the prey of the Jesuits, had made the mistake of appealing to the courts for his custody. This had confirmed Undine's resistance, and her determination to keep the child. The case had been decided in her favor, and she had thereupon demanded, and obtained, an allowance of $5,000, to be devoted to the bringing up and education of her son. This sum, added to what Mr. Spragg had agreed to give her, made up an income which had appreciably bettered her position, and justified Madame de Trésac's discreet allusions to her wealth. Nevertheless, it was one of the facts about which she least liked to think when any chance allusion evoked Ralph's image. The money was hers, of course; she had a right to it, and she was an ardent believer in rights. But she wished she could have got it in some other way. She hated the thought of it as one more instance of the perverseness with which things she was entitled to always came to her as if they had been stolen. The approach of summer, and the culmination of the Paris season, swept aside such thoughts. The Countess Raymond de Chelles, contrasting her situation with that of Mrs. Undine Marvell, and the fullness and animation of her new life with the vacant, dissatisfied days which had followed on from her return from Dakota, forgot the smallness of her apartment, the inconvenient proximity of Paul and his nurse, the interminable round of visits with her mother-in-law, and the long dinners in the solemn hôtels of all the family connection. The world was radiant, the lights were lit, the music playing, she was still young, and better looking than ever, with a countess's coronet, a famous chateau, and a handsome and popular husband who adored her. And then suddenly the lights went out, and the music stopped, when one day Raymond, putting his arm about her, said in his tenderest tones, "And now, my dear, the world's had you long enough, and it's my turn. What do you say to going down to Saint Desert?" End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of The Custom of the Country by Edith Wharton. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. In a window of the long gallery of the Château de Saint Desert, the new Marquise de Chelles stood looking down the poplar avenue into the November rain. It had been raining heavily and persistently for a longer time than she could remember. Day after day the hills beyond the park had been curtained by motionless clouds. The gutters of the long, steep roofs had gurgled with a perpetual overflow, the opaque surface of the moat been peppered by a continuous pelting of big drops. The water lay in glassy stretches under the trees, and along the sodden edges of the garden paths it rose in a white mist from the fields beyond, it exuded in a chill moisture from the brick flooring of the passages, and from the walls of the rooms on the lower floor. Everything in the great empty house smelt of dampness: the stuffing of the chairs, the threadbare folds of the faded curtains, the splendid tapestries, that were fading too on the walls of the room in which Undine stood, and the wide bands of crape which her husband had insisted on her keeping on her black dresses till the last hour of her mourning for the old Marquis. The summer had been more than usually inclement, and since her first coming to the country, Undine had lived through many periods of rainy weather, but none which had gone before had so completely epitomized, so summed up in one vast monotonous blur, the image of her long months at Saint Desert. When, the year before, she had reluctantly suffered herself to be torn from the joys of Paris, she had been sustained by the belief that her exile would not be of long duration. Once Paris was out of sight, she had even found a certain lazy charm in the long warm days at Saint Desert. Her parents-in-law had remained in town, and she enjoyed being alone with her husband, exploring and appraising the treasures of the great half-abandoned house, and watching her boy scamper over the June meadows or trot about the gardens on the pony his stepfather had given him. Paul, after Mrs. Heeny's departure, had grown fretful and restive, and Undine had found it more and more difficult to fit his small, exacting personality into her cramped rooms and crowded life. He irritated her by pining for his Aunt Laura, his Marvell granny, and old Mr. Dagonet's funny stories about gods and fairies. and his wistful allusions to his games with Claire's children sounded like a lesson he might have been drilled in to make her feel how little he belonged to her. But once released from Paris, and blessed with rabbits, a pony, and the freedom of the fields, he became again all that a charming child should be, and for a time it amused her to share in his romps and rambles. Raymond seemed enchanted at the picture they made, and the quiet weeks of fresh air and outdoor activity gave her back a bloom that reflected itself in her tranquilized mood. She was the more resigned to this interlude because she was so sure of its not lasting. Before they left Paris a doctor had been found to say that Paul, who was certainly looking pale and pulled down, was in urgent need of sea air, and Undine had nearly convinced her husband of the expediency of hiring a chalet at Deauville for July and August, when this plan, and with it every other prospect of escape, was dashed by the sudden death of the old Marquis. Undine, at first, had supposed that the resulting change could not be other than favourable. She had been on too formal terms with her father-in-law, a remote and ceremonious old gentleman to whom her own personality was evidently an insoluble enigma, to feel more than the merest conventional pang at his death; and it was certainly more fun to be a marchioness than a countess, and to know that one's husband was the head of the house. Besides, now they would have the chateau to themselves, or at least the old marquise, when she came, would be there as a guest and not a ruler, and visions of smart house parties and big shoots lit up the first weeks of Undine's enforced seclusion. Then, by degrees, the inexorable conditions of French mourning closed in on her. Immediately after the long-drawn funeral observances, the bereaved family, mother, daughters, sons, and sons-in-law, came down to seclude themselves at Saint Desert, and Undine, through the slow, hot, crape-smelling months, lived encircled by shrouded images of woe, in which the only live points were the eyes constantly fixed on her least movements. The hope of escaping to the seaside with Paul vanished in the pained stare with which her mother-in-law received the suggestion. Undine learned the next day that it had cost the old marquise a sleepless night, and might have had more distressing results had it not been explained as a harmless instance of transatlantic oddness. Raymond entreated his wife to atone for her involuntary légèreté by submitting with a good grace to the usages of her adopted country, and he seemed to regard the remaining months of the summer as hardly long enough for this act of expiation. As Undine looked back on them, they appeared to have been composed of an interminable succession of identical days, in which attendance at early mass, in the coroneted gallery she had once so glowingly depicted to Van Degen, was followed by a great deal of conversational sitting about, a great deal of excellent eating, an occasional drive to the nearest town behind a pair of heavy draught horses, and long evenings in a lamp-heated drawing-room with all the windows shut, and the stout curé making an asthmatic fourth at the marquise's card-table. Still, even these conditions were not permanent, and the discipline of the last years had trained Undine to wait and dissemble. The summer over, it was decided, after a protracted family conclave, that the state of the old marquise's health made it advisable for her to spend the winter with the married daughter who lived near Pau. The other members of the family returned to their respective estates, and Undine once more found herself alone with her husband. But she knew by this time that there was to be no thought of Paris that winter, or even the next spring. Worse still, she was presently to discover that Raymond's accession of rank brought with it no financial advantages. Having but the vaguest notion of French testamentary law, she was dismayed to learn that the compulsory division of property made it impossible for a father to benefit his eldest son at the expense of the others. Raymond was therefore little richer than before, and with the debts of honor of a troublesome younger brother to settle and Saint Desert to keep up, his available income was actually reduced. He held out, indeed, the hope of eventual improvement, since the old marquis had managed his estates with a lofty contempt for modern methods, and the application of new principles of agriculture and forestry were certain to yield profitable results. But for a year or two, at any rate, this very change of treatment would necessitate the owner's continual supervision, and would not in the meanwhile produce any increase of income. To faire valoir the family acres had always, it appeared, been Raymond's deepest seated purpose, and all his frivolities dropped from him with the prospect of putting his hand to the plough. He was not, indeed, inhuman enough to condemn his wife to perpetual exile.
He meant, he assured her, that she should have her annual spring visit to Paris, but he stared in dismay at her suggestion that they should take possession of the coveted première of the Hôtel de Chelles. He was gallant enough to express the wish that it were in his power to house her on such a scale, but he could not conceal his surprise that she had ever seriously expected it. She was beginning to see that he felt her constitutional inability to understand anything about money as the deepest difference between them. It was a proficiency no one had ever expected her to acquire, and the lack of which she had even been encouraged to regard as a grace and to use as a pretext. During the interval between her divorce and her remarriage she had learned what things cost, but not how to do without them, and money still seemed to her like some mysterious and uncertain stream which occasionally vanished underground, but was sure to bubble up again at one's feet. Now, however, she found herself in a world where it represented not the means of individual gratification, but the substance binding together whole groups of interests, and where the uses to which it might be put in 20 years were considered before the reasons for spending it on the spot. At first she was sure she could laugh Raymond out of his prudence, or coax him round to her point of view. She did not understand how a man so romantically in love could be so unpersuadable on certain points. Hitherto she had had to contend with personal moods, now she was arguing against a policy, and she was gradually to learn that it was as natural to Raymond de Chelles to adore her and resist her as it had been to Ralph Marvell to adore her and let her have her way. At first, indeed, he appealed to her good sense, using arguments evidently drawn from accumulations of hereditary experience, but his economic plea was as unintelligible to her as the silly problems about penknives and apples in the mental arithmetic of her infancy, and when he struck a tenderer note and spoke of the duty of providing for the son he hoped for, she put her arms about him to whisper, "But then I oughtn't to be worried." After that, she noticed, though he was as charming as ever, he behaved as if the case were closed. He had apparently decided that his arguments were unintelligible to her, and under all his ardor she felt the difference made by the discovery. It did not make him any less kind, but it evidently made her less important, and she had the half-frightened sense that the day she ceased to please him she would cease to exist for him. That day was a long way off, of course, but the chill of it had brushed her face, and she was no longer heedless of such signs. She resolved to cultivate all the arts of patience and compliance, and habit might have helped them to take root if they had not been nipped by a new cataclysm. It was barely a week ago that her husband had been called to Paris to straighten out a fresh tangle in the affairs of the troublesome brother, whose difficulties were apparently a part of the family tradition. Raymond's letters had been hurried, his telegrams brief and contradictory, and now, as Undine stood watching for the brougham that was to bring him from the station, she had the sense that with his arrival all her vague fears would be confirmed. There would be more money to pay out, of course, since the funds that could not be found for her just needs were apparently always forthcoming to settle Hubert's scandalous prodigalities, and that meant a longer perspective of solitude at Saint Desert, and a fresh pretext for postponing the hospitalities that were to follow on their period of mourning. The brougham, a vehicle as massive and lumbering as the pair that drew it, presently rolled into the court, and Raymond's sable figure, she had never before seen a man travel in such black clothes, sprang up the steps to the door. Whenever Undine saw him after an absence, she had a curious sense of his coming back from an unknown distance and not belonging to her or to any state of things she understood. Then habit reasserted itself, and she began to think of him again with a querulous familiarity. But she had learned to hide her feelings, and as he came in she put up her face for a kiss. "Yes, everything settled." His embrace expressed the satisfaction of the man returning from an accomplished task to the joys of his fireside. "Settled?" Her face kindled. "Without your having to pay?" He looked at her with a shrug. "Of course I've had to pay. Did you suppose Hubert's creditors would be put off with vanilla éclair?" "Oh, if that's what you mean, if Hubert has only to wire you at any time to be sure of his affairs being settled." She saw his lips narrow and a line come out between his eyes. "Wouldn't it be a happy thought to tell them to bring tea?" he suggested. "In the library, then. It's so cold here, and the tapestries smell so of rain." He paused a moment to scrutinize the long walls.
on which the fabulous blues and pinks of the great Boucher series looked as livid as withered roses.
"I suppose they ought to be taken down and aired," he said.
She thought, in this air, much good it would do them. But she had already repented her outbreak about Hubert, and she followed her husband into the library with the resolve not to let him see her annoyance. Compared with the long grey gallery, the library, with its brown walls of books, looked warm and homelike, and Raymond seemed to feel the influence of the softer atmosphere. He turned to his wife and put his arm about her.
"I know it's been a trial to you, dearest, but this is the last time I shall have to pull the poor boy out."
In spite of herself, she laughed incredulously. Hubert's last times were a household word. But when tea had been brought, and they were alone over the fire, Raymond unfolded the amazing sequel. Hubert had found an heiress, Hubert was to be married, and henceforth the business of paying his debts, which might be counted on to recur as inevitably as the changes of the season, would devolve on his American bride, the charming Miss Looty Arlington, whom Raymond had remained over in Paris to meet. An American? He's marrying an American? Undine wavered between wrath and satisfaction. She felt a flash of resentment at any other intruders venturing upon her territory. Looty Arlington? Who is she? What a name! But it was quickly superseded by the relief of knowing that henceforth, as Raymond said, Hubert's debts would be someone else's business. Then a third consideration prevailed. But if he's engaged to a rich girl, why on earth do we have to pull him out? Her husband explained that no other course was possible. Though General Arlington was immensely wealthy, her father's a general manager, whatever that may be. He had exacted what he called a clean slate from his future son-in-law, and Hubert's creditors, the boy was such a donkey, had in their possession certain papers that made it possible for them to press for immediate payment. Your compatriots' views on such matters are so rigid, and it's all to their credit, that the marriage would have fallen through at once if the least hint of Hubert's mess had got out, and then we should have had him on our hands for life. Yes, from that point of view it was doubtless best to pay up, but Undine obscurely wished that their doing so had not incidentally helped an unknown compatriot to what the American papers were no doubt already announcing as another brilliant foreign alliance. Where on earth did your brother pick up anybody respectable? Do you know where her people come from? I suppose she's perfectly awful," she broke out with a sudden escape of irritation.
"I believe Hubert made her acquaintance at a skating rink. They come from some new state. The General apologized for its not yet being on the map, but seemed surprised I hadn't heard of it. He said it was already known as one of the divorce states, and the principal city had, in consequence, a very agreeable society. La petite n'est vraiment pas trop mal."
I dare say not. We're all good-looking. But she must be horribly common. Raymond seemed sincerely unable to formulate a judgment.
"My dear, you have your own customs."
Oh, I know we're all alike to you. It was one of her grievances that he never attempted to discriminate between Americans. You see no difference between me and a girl one gets engaged to at a skating rink. He evaded the challenge by rejoining,
"Miss Arlington's burning to know about you. She says she's heard a great deal about you, and Hubert wants to bring her down next week. I think we'd better do what we can."
Of course. But Undine was still absorbed in the economic aspect of the case. If they're as rich as you say, I suppose Hubert means to pay you back by and by.
"Naturally. It's all arranged. He's given me a paper."
He drew her hands into his.
"You see, we've every reason to be kind to Miss Arlington."
Oh, I'll be as kind as you like. She brightened at the prospect of repayment. Yes, they would ask the girl down. She leaned a little nearer to her husband. But then after a while we shall be a good deal better off, especially, as you say, with no more of Hubert's debts to worry us. And leaning back far enough to give her upward smile, she renewed her plea for the première in the Hôtel de Chelles. Because really, you know, as the head of the house you ought to.
"Ah, my dear, as the head of the house I've so many obligations, and one of them is not to miss a good stroke of business when it comes my way."
Her hand slipped from his shoulders, and she drew back. What do you mean by a good stroke of business?
Why, an incredible piece of luck. It's what kept me on so long in Paris. Miss Arlington's father was looking for an apartment for the young couple, and I've let him the premiere for 12 years, on the understanding that he puts electric lights and heating into the whole hotel. It's a wonderful chance, for of course we all benefit by it as much as Hubert. A wonderful chance? Benefit by it as much as Hubert? He seemed to be speaking a strange language, in which familiar-sounding syllables meant something totally unknown. Did he really think she was going to coop herself up again in their cramped quarters, while Hubert and his skating-rink bride luxuriated overhead in the coveted premiere? All the resentments that had been accumulating in her during the long, baffled months since her marriage broke into speech. "It's extraordinary of you to do such a thing without consulting me." "Without consulting you? But, my dear child, you've always professed the most complete indifference to business matters. You frequently begged me not to bore you with them. You may be sure I've acted on the best advice, and my mother, whose head is as good as a man's, thinks I've made a remarkably good arrangement." "I dare say, but I'm not always thinking about money as you are." As she spoke she had an ominous sense of impending peril, but she was too angry to avoid even the risks she saw. To her surprise, Raymond put his arm about her with a smile. "There are many reasons why I have to think about money. One is that you don't, and another is that I must look out for the future of our son." Undine flushed to the forehead. She had grown accustomed to such allusions, and the thought of having a child no longer filled her with the resentful terror she had felt before Paul's birth. She had been insensibly influenced by a different point of view, perhaps also by a difference in her own feeling, and the vision of herself as the mother of the future Marquis de Chelles was softened to happiness by the thought of giving Raymond a son. But all these lightly rooted sentiments went down in the rush of her resentment, and she freed herself with a petulant movement. "Oh, my dear, you'd better leave it to your brother to perpetuate the race. There'll be more room for nurseries in their apartment." She waited a moment, quivering with the expectation of her husband's answer. Then, as none came except the silent darkening of his face, she walked to the door and turned round to fling back, "Of course you can do what you like with your own house, and make any arrangements that suit your family, without consulting me. But you needn't think I'm ever going back to live in that stuffy little hole, with Hubert and his wife splurging round on top of our heads." "Ah," said Raymond de Chelles, in a low voice. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of The Custom of the Country, by Edith Wharton. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Undine did not fulfill her threat. The month of May saw her back in the rooms she had declared she would never set foot in, and after her long sojourn among the echoing vistas of Saint Desert, the exiguity of her Paris quarters seemed like cosiness. In the interval many things had happened. Hubert, permitted by his anxious relatives to anticipate the term of the family mourning, had been showily and expensively united to his heiress. The Hôtel de Chelles had been piped, heated, and illuminated in accordance with the bride's requirements, and the young couple, not content with these utilitarian changes, had moved doors, opened windows, torn down partitions, and given over the great trophied and pilastered dining-room to a decorative painter with a new theory of the human anatomy. Undine had silently assisted at this spectacle, and at the sight of the old marquise's abject acquiescence, she had seen the Duchesse de Dorzogne and the Princess Estradina go past her door to visit Hubert's première and marvel at the American bath-tubs and the Annamite bric-a-brac, and she had been present with her husband at the banquet at which Hubert had revealed to the astonished faubourg the prehistoric episodes depicted on his dining-room walls. She had accepted all these necessities with the stoicism which the last months had developed in her, for more and more, as the days passed, she felt herself in the grasp of circumstances stronger than any effort she could oppose to them. The very absence of external pressure, of any tactless assertion of authority on her husband's part, intensified the sense of her helplessness. He simply left it to her to infer that,
Important as she might be to him in certain ways, there were others in which she did not weigh a feather. Their outward relations had not changed since her outburst on the subject of Hubert's marriage. That incident had left her half ashamed, half frightened at her behavior, and she had tried to atone for it by the indirect arts that were her nearest approach to acknowledging herself in the wrong. Raymond met her advances with a good grace, and they lived through the rest of the winter on terms of apparent understanding. When the spring approached, it was he who suggested that, since his mother had consented to Hubert's marrying before the year of mourning was over, there was really no reason why they should not go up to Paris as usual, and she was surprised at the readiness with which he prepared to accompany her. A year earlier she would have regarded this as another proof of her power, but now she drew her inferences less quickly. Raymond was as lovely to her as ever, but more than once during their months in the country she had had a startled sense of not giving him all he expected of her. She had admired him before their marriage as a model of social distinction. During the honeymoon he had been the most ardent of lovers, and with their settling down at Saint Desert she had prepared to resign herself to the society of a country gentleman absorbed in sport and agriculture. But Raymond, to her surprise, had again developed a disturbing resemblance to his predecessor. During the long winter afternoons, after he had gone over his accounts with the bailiff or written his business letters, he took to dabbling with a paint-box or picking out new scores at the piano. After dinner, when they went to the library, he seemed to expect to read aloud to her from the reviews and papers he was always receiving, and when he had discovered her inability to fix her attention, he fell into the way of absorbing himself in one of the old brown books with which the room was lined. At first he tried, as Ralph had done, to tell her about what he was reading or what was happening in the world, but her sense of inadequacy made her slip away to other subjects, and little by little their talk died down to monosyllables. Was it possible that, in spite of his books, the evenings seemed as long to Raymond as to her, and that he had suggested going back to Paris because he was bored at Saint Desert? Bored as she was herself, she resented his not finding her company all sufficient, and was mortified by the discovery that there were regions of his life she could not enter. But once back in Paris, she had less time for introspection, and Raymond less for books. They resumed their dispersed and busy life, and in spite of Hubert's ostentatious vicinity, of the perpetual lack of money, and of Paul's innocent encroachments on her freedom, Undine, once more in her element, ceased to brood upon her grievances. She enjoyed going about with her husband, whose presence at her side was distinctly ornamental. He seemed to have grown suddenly younger and more animated, and when she saw other women looking at him, she remembered how distinguished he was. It amused her to have him in her train, and driving about with him to dinners and dances, waiting for him on flower-decked landings, or pushing at his side through blazing theatre lobbies, answered to her inmost ideal of domestic intimacy. He seemed disposed to allow her more liberty than before, and it was only now and then that he let drop a brief reminder of the conditions on which it was accorded. She was to keep certain people at a distance. She was not to cheapen herself by being seen at vulgar restaurants and tea-rooms. She was to join with him in fulfilling certain family obligations, going to a good many dull dinners among the number, but in other respects she was free to fill her days as she pleased. "Not that it leaves me much time," she admitted to Madame de Trezac. "What with going to see his mother every day, and never missing one of his sister's jours, and showing myself at the Hôtel de Dordogne whenever the Duchess gives a pay-up party to the stuffy people Lily Estradina won't be bothered with, there are days when I never lay eyes on Paul, and barely have time to be waved and manicured. But apart from that, Raymond's really much nicer and less fussy than he was." Undine, as she grew older, had developed her mother's craving for a confidante, and Madame de Trezac had succeeded in that capacity to Mabel Lipscomb and Bertha Shallum. "Less fussy?" Madame de Trezac's long nose lengthened thoughtfully. Are you sure that's a good sign?" Undine stared and laughed. "Oh, my dear, you're so quaint! Why, nobody's jealous any more." "No, that's the worst of it." Madame de Trezac pondered. "It's 1,000 pities you haven't got a son." "Yes, I wish we had." Undine stood up, impatient to end the conversation. Since she had learned that her continued childlessness was regarded by everyone about her as not only unfortunate, but somehow vaguely derogatory to her, she had genuinely begun to regret it, and any allusion to the subject disturbed her. "Especially," Madame de Trezac continued, "as Hubert's wife. Oh, if that's all they want, it's a pity Raymond didn't marry Hubert's wife!" Undine flung back, and on the stairs she murmured to herself, "Nettie has been talking to my mother-in-law." But this explanation did not quiet her, and that evening, as she and Raymond drove back together from a party, she felt a sudden impulse to speak. Sitting close to him in the darkness of the carriage, it ought to have been easy for her to find the needed word, but the barrier of his indifference hung between them, and street after street slipped by, and the spangled blackness of the river unrolled itself beneath their wheels, before she leaned over to touch his hand. "What is it, my dear?" She had not yet found the word, and already his tone told her she was too late. A year ago, if she had slipped her hand in his, she would not have had that answer. "Your mother blames me for our not having a child. Everybody thinks it's my fault." He paused before answering, and she sat watching his shadowy profile against the passing lamps. "My mother's ideas are old-fashioned, and I don't know that it's anybody's business but yours and mine." "Yes, but—" "Here we are." The brougham was turning under the archway of the hotel, and the light of Hubert's tall windows fell across the dusky court. Raymond helped her out, and they mounted to their door by the stairs which Hubert had recarpeted in velvet, with a marble nymph lurking in the azaleas on the landing. In the antechamber Raymond paused to take her cloak from her shoulders, and his eyes rested on her with a faint smile of approval. "You never looked better. Your dress is extremely becoming. Good night, my dear," he said, kissing her hand as he turned away. Undine kept this incident to herself. Her wounded pride made her shrink from confessing it even to Madame de Trezac. She was sure Raymond would "come back." Ralph always had, to the last. During their remaining weeks in Paris she reassured herself with the thought that once they were back at Saint Desert she would easily regain her lost hold, and when Raymond suggested their leaving Paris she acquiesced without a protest. But at Saint Desert she seemed no nearer to him than in Paris. He continued to treat her with unvarying amiability, but he seemed wholly absorbed in the management of the estate, in his books, his sketching, and his music. He had begun to interest himself in politics, and had been urged to stand for his department. This necessitated frequent displacements, trips to Beaune or Dijon, and occasional absences in Paris. Undine, when he was away, was not left alone, for the Dowager Marquise had established herself at Saint Desert for the summer, and relays of brothers and sisters-in-law, aunts, cousins, and ecclesiastical friends and connections succeeded each other under its capacious roof. Only Hubert and his wife were absent. They had taken a villa at Deauville, and in the morning papers Undine followed the chronicle of Hubert's polo scores and of the Countess Hubert's racing toilets. The days crawled on with a benumbing sameness. The old marquise and the other ladies of the party sat on the terrace with their needlework. The curé or one of the visiting uncles read aloud the Journal des Débats and prognosticated dark things of the Republic. Paul scoured the park and despoiled the kitchen garden with the other children of the family. The inhabitants of the adjacent chateau drove over to call, and occasionally the ponderous pair were harnessed to a landau as lumbering as the brougham, and the ladies of Saint Desert measured the dusky kilometres between themselves and their neighbours. It was the first time that Undine had seriously paused to consider the conditions of her new life, and as the days passed she began to understand that so they would continue to succeed each other till the end. Everyone about her took it for granted that as long as she lived she would spend 10 months of every year at Saint Desert and the remaining 2 at Paris. Of course, if health required it, she might go to Les Eaux with her husband, but the old marquise was very doubtful as to the benefit of a course of waters, and her uncle the Duke and her cousin the Canon shared her view. In the case of young married women especially, the unwholesome excitement of the modern watering place was more than likely to do away with the possible benefit of the treatment. As to travel, had not Raymond and his wife been to Egypt and Asia Minor on their wedding journey? Such reckless enterprise was unheard of in the annals of the house. Had they not spent days and days in the saddle, and slept in tents among the Arabs? Who could tell, indeed, whether these imprudences were not the cause of the disappointment which it had pleased Heaven to inflict on the young couple. No one in the family had ever taken so long a wedding journey. One bride had gone to England, even that was considered extreme, and another, the artistic daughter, had spent a week in Venice, which certainly showed that they were not behind the times and had no old-fashioned prejudices. Since wedding journeys were the fashion, they had taken them. But who had ever heard of travelling afterwards? What could be the possible object of leaving one's family, one's habits, one's friends? It was natural that the Americans, who had no homes, who were born and died in hotels, should have contracted nomadic habits, but the new Marquise de Chelles was no longer an American, and she had Saint Desert and the Hôtel de Chelles to live in, as generations of ladies of her name had done before her. Thus Undine beheld her future laid out for her, not directly and in blunt words, but obliquely and affably, in the allusions, the assumptions, the insinuations of the amiable women among whom her days were spent. Their interminable conversations were carried on to the click of knitting needles and the rise and fall of industrious fingers above embroidery frames, and as Undine sat staring at the lustrous nails of her idle hands, she felt that her inability to occupy them was regarded as one of the chief causes of her restlessness. The innumerable rooms of Saint Desert were furnished with the embroidered hangings and tapestry chairs produced by generations of diligent chatelaines, and the untiring needles of the old marquise, her daughters and dependents, were still steadily increasing the provision. It struck Undine as curious that they should be willing to go on making chair coverings and bed curtains for a house that didn't really belong to them, and that she had a right to pull about and rearrange as she chose. But then that was only a part of their whole incomprehensible way of regarding themselves, in spite of their acute personal and parochial absorptions, as minor members of a powerful and indivisible whole, the huge voracious fetish they called the family. Notwithstanding their very definite theories as to what Americans were and were not, they were evidently bewildered at finding no corresponding sense of solidarity in Undine, and little Paul's rootlessness, his lack of all local and linear ties, made them, for all the charm he exercised, regard him with something of the shyness of pious Christians toward an elfin child. But though mother and child gave them a sense of insuperable strangeness, it plainly never occurred to them that both would not be gradually subdued to the customs of Saint Desert. Dynasties had fallen, institutions changed, manners and morals, alas, deplorably declined; but as far back as memory went, the ladies of the line of Chelles had always sat at their needlework on the terrace of Saint Desert, while the men of the house lamented the corruption of the government, and the curé ascribed the unhappy state of the country to the decline of religious feeling and the rise in the cost of living. It was inevitable that, in the course of time, the new marquise should come to understand the fundamental necessity of these things being as they were, and meanwhile the forbearance of her husband's family exercised itself, with the smiling discretion of their race, through the long succession of uneventful days. Once, in September, this routine was broken in upon by the unannounced descent of a flock of motors bearing the Princess Estradina and a chosen band from one watering-place to another. Raymond was away at the time, but family loyalty constrained the old marquise to welcome her kinswoman and the latter's friends, and Undine once more found herself immersed in the world from which her marriage had removed her. The princess, at first, seemed totally to have forgotten their former intimacy, and Undine was made to feel that in a life so variously agitated the episode could hardly have left a trace. But the night before her departure, the incalculable Lily, with one of her sudden changes of humour, drew her former friend into her bedroom and plunged into an exchange of confidences. She naturally unfolded her own history first, and it was so packed with incident that the courtyard clock had struck 2 before she turned her attention to Undine. "My dear, you're handsomer than ever, only perhaps a shade too stout. Domestic bliss, I suppose. Take care. You need an emotion, a drama. You Americans are really extraordinary. You appear to live on change and excitement, and then suddenly a man comes along and claps a ring on your finger, and you never look through it to see what's going on outside. Aren't you ever the least bit bored? Why do I never see anything of you any more? I suppose it's the fault of my venerable aunt. She's never forgiven me for having a better time than her daughters. How can I help it if I don't look like the curé's umbrella?
I dare say she owes you the same grudge. But why do you let her coop you up here? It's a thousand pities you haven't had a child. They'd all treat you differently if you had." It was the same perpetually reiterated condolence, and Undine flushed with anger as she listened. Why, indeed, had she let herself be cooped up? She could not have answered the princess's question. She merely felt the impossibility of breaking through the mysterious web of traditions, conventions, prohibitions that enclosed her in their impenetrable network. But her vanity suggested the obvious pretext, and she murmured with a laugh, "I didn't know Raymond was going to be so jealous." The princess stared. "Is it Raymond who keeps you shut up here? And what about his trips to Dijon? And what do you suppose he does with himself when he runs up to Paris? Politics?" She shrugged ironically. "Politics don't occupy a man after midnight. Raymond jealous of you? Ah, merci. My dear, it's what I always say when people talk to me about fast Americans. You're the only innocent women left in the world." End of chapter 39.
Chapter 40 of The Custom of the Country by Edith Wharton. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. After the Princess Estradina's departure, the days at Saint Desert succeeded each other indistinguishably, and more as they passed, Undine felt herself drawn into the slow, strong current already fed by so many tributary lives. Some spell she could not have named seemed to emanate from the old house, which had so long been the custodian of an unbroken tradition. Things had happened there in the same way for so many generations that to try and alter them seemed as vain as to contend with the elements. Winter came and went, and once more the calendar marked the first days of spring. But though the horse-chestnuts of the Champs-Élysées were budding, snow still lingered in the grass-drives of Saint Desert and along the ridges of the hills beyond the park. Sometimes, as Undine looked out of the windows of the Boucher gallery, she felt as if her eyes had never rested on any other scene. Even her occasional brief trips to Paris left no lasting trace. The life of the vivid streets faded to a shadow as soon as the black and white horizon of Saint Desert closed in on her again. Though the afternoons were still cold, she had lately taken to sitting in the gallery. The smiling scenes on its walls, and the tall screens which broke its length, made it more habitable than the drawing-rooms beyond. But her chief reason for preferring it was the satisfaction she found in having fires lit in both the monumental chimneys that faced each other down its long perspective. This satisfaction had its source in the old marquise's disapproval. Never before in the history of Saint Desert had the consumption of firewood exceeded a certain carefully calculated measure, but since Undine had been in authority this allowance had been doubled. If anyone had told her a year earlier that one of the chief distractions of her new life would be to invent ways of annoying her mother-in-law, she would have laughed at the idea of wasting her time on such trifles. But she found herself with a great deal of time to waste, and with a fierce desire to spend it in upsetting the immemorial customs of Saint Desert. Her husband had mastered her in essentials, but she had discovered innumerable small ways of irritating and hurting him, and one, and not the least effectual, was to do anything that went counter to his mother's prejudices. It was not that he always shared her views, or was a particularly subservient son, but it seemed to be one of his fundamental principles that a man should respect his mother's wishes, and see to it that his household respected them. All Frenchmen of his class appeared to share this view, and to regard it as beyond discussion. It was based on something so much more immutable than personal feeling that one might even hate one's mother, and yet insist that her ideas as to the consumption of firewood should be regarded. The old marquise during the cold weather always sat in her bedroom, and there, between the tapestried four-poster and the fireplace, the family grouped itself around the ground glass of her single Carcel lamp. In the evening, if there were visitors, a fire was lit in the library; otherwise the family again sat about the marquise's lamp till the footman came in at 10 with tisane and biscuit cerim. after which every one bade the dowager good night and scattered down the corridors to chill distances marked by tapers floating in cups of oil. Since Undine's coming, the library fire had never been allowed to go out, and of late, after experimenting with the 2 drawing-rooms and the so-called study where Raymond kept his guns and saw the bailiff, she had selected the gallery as the most suitable place for the new and unfamiliar ceremony of afternoon tea. Afternoon refreshments had never before been served at Saint Desert except when company was expected, when they had invariably consisted in a decanter of sweet port and a plate of small dry cakes, the kind that kept. That the complicated rites of the tea-urn, with its offering up of perishable delicacies, should be enacted for the sole enjoyment of the family, was a thing so unheard of that for a while Undine found sufficient amusement in elaborating the ceremonial, and in making the ancestral plate groan under more varied viands; and when this palled, she devised the plan of performing the office in the gallery and lighting sacrificial fires in both chimneys. She said to Raymond at first, "It's ridiculous that your mother should sit in her bedroom all day. She says she does it to save fires, but if we have a fire downstairs, why can't she let hers go out and come down? I don't see why I should spend my life in your mother's bedroom." Raymond made no answer, and the marquise did in fact let her fire go out, but she did not come down. She simply continued to sit upstairs without a fire. At first this also amused Undine, then the tacit criticism implied began to irritate her. She hoped Raymond would speak of his mother's attitude; she had her answer ready if he did. But he made no comment, he took no notice; her impulses of retaliation spent themselves against the blank surface of his indifference. He was as amiable, as considerate as ever, as ready, within reason, to accede to her wishes and gratify her whims. Once or twice, when she suggested running up to Paris to take Paul to the dentist or to look for a servant, he agreed to the necessity and went up with her. But instead of going to an hotel, they went to their apartment, where carpets were up and curtains down, and a caretaker prepared primitive food at uncertain hours, and Undine's first glimpse of Hubert's illuminated windows deepened her rancour and her sense of helplessness. As Madame de Trezac had predicted, Raymond's vigilance gradually relaxed, and during their excursions to the capital, Undine came and went as she pleased; but her visits were too short to permit of her falling in with the social pace, and when she showed herself among her friends she felt countrified and out of place, as if even her clothes had come from Saint Desert. Nevertheless, her dresses were more than ever her chief preoccupation. In Paris she spent hours at the dressmaker's, and in the country the arrival of a box of new gowns was the chief event of the vacant days. But there was more bitterness than joy in the unpacking, and the dresses hung in her wardrobe like so many unfulfilled promises of pleasure, reminding her of the days at the Stentorian, when she had reviewed other finery with the same cheated eyes. In spite of this, she multiplied her orders, writing up to the dressmakers for patterns, and to the milliners for boxes of hats which she tried on and kept for days without being able to make a choice. Now and then she even sent her maid up to Paris to bring back great assortments of veils, gloves, flowers, and laces, and after periods of painful indecision she ended by keeping the greater number, lest those she sent back should turn out to be the ones that were worn in Paris. She knew she was spending too much money, and she had lost her youthful faith in providential solutions, but she had always had the habit of going out to buy something when she was bored, and never had she been in greater need of such solace. The dullness of her life seemed to have passed into her blood; her complexion was less animated, her hair less shining. The change in her looks alarmed her, and she scanned the fashion papers for new scents and powders, and experimented in facial bandaging, electric massage, and other processes of renovation. Odd atavisms woke in her, and she began to pore over patent medicine advertisements, to send stamped envelopes to beauty doctors and professors of physical development, and to brood on the advantage of consulting faith healers, mind readers, and their kindred adepts. She even wrote to her mother for the receipts of some of her grandfather's forgotten nostrums, and modified her daily life and her hours of sleeping, eating, and exercise in accordance with each new experiment. Her constitutional restlessness lapsed into an apathy like Mrs. Spragg's,
and the least demand on her activity irritated her. But she was beset by endless annoyances, bickerings with discontented maids, the difficulty of finding a tutor for Paul, and the problem of keeping him amused and occupied without having him too much on her hands. A great liking had sprung up between Raymond and the little boy, and during the summer Paul was perpetually at his stepfather's side in the stables and the park. But with the coming of winter Raymond was oftener away, and Paul developed a persistent cold that kept him frequently indoors. The confinement made him fretful and exacting, and the old marquise ascribed the change in his behaviour to the deplorable influence of his tutor, a laic recommended by one of Raymond's old professors. Raymond himself would have preferred an abbé. It was in the tradition of the house, and though Paul was not of the house, it seemed fitting that he should conform to its ways. Moreover, when the married sisters came to stay, they objected to having their children exposed to the tutor's influence, and even implied that Paul's society might be contaminating. But Undine, though she had so readily embraced her husband's faith, stubbornly resisted the suggestion that she should hand over her son to the Church. The tutor therefore remained, but the friction caused by his presence was so irritating to Undine that she began to consider the alternative of sending Paul to school. He was still small and tender for the experiment, but she persuaded herself that what he needed was hardening, and having heard of a school where fashionable infancy was subjected to this process, she entered into correspondence with the master. His first letter convinced her that his establishment was just the place for Paul, but the second contained the price list, and after comparing it with the tutor's keep and salary, she wrote to say she feared her little boy was too young to be sent away from home. Her husband, for some time past, had ceased to make any comment on her expenditure. She knew he thought her too extravagant, and felt sure he was minutely aware of what she spent, for Saint Desert projected on economic details a light as different as might be from the haze that veiled them in West End Avenue. She therefore concluded that Raymond's silence was intentional, and ascribed it to his having shortcomings of his own to conceal. The Princess Estradina's pleasantry had reached its mark. Undine did not believe that her husband was seriously in love with another woman. She could not conceive that any one could tire of her of whom she had not first tired. But she was humiliated by his indifference, and it was easier to ascribe it to the arts of a rival than to any deficiency in herself. It exasperated her to think that he might have consolations for the outward monotony of his life, and she resolved that when they returned to Paris he should see that she was not without similar opportunities. March, meanwhile, was verging on April, and still he did not speak of leaving. Undine had learned that he expected to have such decisions left to him, and she hid her impatience lest her showing it should incline him to delay. But one day, as she sat at tea in the gallery, he came in his riding clothes and said, "I've been over to the other side of the mountain. The February rains have weakened the dam of the Alette, and the vineyards will be in danger if we don't rebuild at once." She suppressed a yawn, thinking as she did so how dull he always looked when he talked of agriculture. It made him seem years older, and she reflected with a shiver that listening to him probably gave her the same look. He went on as she handed him his tea. "I'm sorry it should happen just now. I'm afraid I shall have to ask you to give up your spring in Paris." "Oh, no, no!" she broke out. A throng of half-subdued grievances choked in her. She wanted to burst into sobs like a child. "I know it's a disappointment, but our expenses have been unusually heavy this year." "It seems to me they always are. I don't see why we should give up Paris because you've got to make repairs to a dam. Isn't Hubert ever going to pay back that money?" He looked at her with mild surprise. "But surely you understood at the time that it won't be possible till his wife inherits." "Till General Arlington dies, you mean? He doesn't look much older than you." "You may remember that I showed you Hubert's note. He has paid the interest quite regularly." "That's kind of him." She stood up, flaming with rebellion. "You can do as you please, but I mean to go to Paris." "My mother is not going. I didn't intend to open our apartment." "I understand. But I shall open it. That's all." He had risen too, and she saw his face whiten. "I prefer that you shouldn't go without me." "Then I shall go and stay at the Nouveau Luxe with my American friends." "That never." "Why not?" I consider it unsuitable.
Your considering it so doesn't prove it. They stood facing each other, quivering with an equal anger. Then he controlled himself, and said in a more conciliatory tone,
You never seem to see that there are necessities.
"Oh, neither do you. That's the trouble. You can't keep me shut up here all my life, and interfere with everything I want to do, just by saying it's unsuitable."
I've never interfered with your spending your money as you please.
It was her turn to stare, sincerely wondering. "Mercy, I should hope not, when you've always grudged me every penny of yours."
You know it's not because I grudge it. I would gladly take you to Paris if I had the money.
You can always find the money to spend on this place. Why don't you sell it if it's so fearfully expensive?"
Sell it? Sell Saint-Desert?
The suggestion seemed to strike him as something monstrous, almost fiendishly significant, as if her random word had at last thrust into his hand the clue to their whole unhappy difference. Without understanding this, she guessed it from the change in his face. It was as if a deadly solvent had suddenly decomposed its familiar lines. "Well, why not?" His horror spurred her on. "You might sell some of the things in it, anyhow. In America we're not ashamed to sell what we can't afford to keep." Her eyes fell on the storied hangings at his back. "Why, there's a fortune in this one room. You could get anything you chose for those tapestries. And you stand here and tell me you're a pauper!" His glance followed hers to the tapestries, and then returned to her face.
Ah, you don't understand, he said.
"I understand that you care for all this old stuff more than you do for me, and that you'd rather see me unhappy and miserable than touch one of your great-grandfather's armchairs." The colour came slowly back to his face, but it hardened into lines she had never seen. He looked at her as though the place where she stood were empty.
You don't understand, he said again.
End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of The Custom of the Country by Edith Wharton. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The incident left Undine with the baffled feeling of not being able to count on any of her old weapons of aggression. In all her struggles for authority, her sense of the rightfulness of her cause had been measured by her power of making people do as she pleased. Raymond's firmness shook her faith in her own claims, and a blind desire to wound and destroy replaced her usual business-like intentness on gaining her end. But her ironies were as ineffectual as her arguments, and his imperviousness was the more exasperating because she divined that some of the things she said would have hurt him if any one else had said them. It was the fact of their coming from her that made them innocuous. Even when, at the close of their talk, she had burst out, "If you grudge me everything I care about, we'd better separate," he had merely answered with a shrug.
"It's one of the things we don't do."
And the answer had been like the slamming of an iron door in her face. An interval of silent brooding had resulted in a reaction of rebellion. She dared not carry out her threat of joining her compatriots at the Nouveau Luxe. She had too clear a memory of the results of her former revolt. But neither could she submit to her present fate without attempting to make Raymond understand his selfish folly. She had failed to prove it by argument, but she had an inherited faith in the value of practical demonstration. If he could be made to see how easily he could give her what she wanted, perhaps he might come round to her view. With this idea in mind, she had gone up to Paris for 24 hours, on the pretext of finding a new nurse for Paul, and the steps then taken had enabled her, on the first occasion, to set her plan in motion. The occasion was furnished by Raymond's next trip to Beaune. He went off early one morning, leaving word that he should not be back till night, and on the afternoon of the same day she stood at her usual post in the gallery, scanning the long perspective of the poplar avenue. She had not stood there long before a black speck at the end of the avenue expanded into a motor that was presently throbbing at the entrance. Undine, at its approach, turned from the window, and as she moved down the gallery her glance rested on the great tapestries,
with their ineffable minglings of blue and rose, as complacently as though they had been mirrors reflecting her own image. She was still looking at them when the door opened, and a servant ushered in a small, swarthy man, who, in spite of his conspicuously London-made clothes, had an odd exotic air, as if he had worn rings in his ears or left a bale of spices at the door. He bowed to Undine, cast a rapid eye up and down the room, and then, with his back to the windows, stood intensely contemplating the wall that faced them. Undine's heart was beating excitedly. She knew the old marquise was taking her afternoon nap in her room, yet each sound in the silent house seemed to be that of her heels on the stairs. "Ah," said the visitor. He began to pace slowly down the gallery, keeping his face to the tapestries, like an actor playing to the footlights. "Ah," he said again. To ease the tension of her nerves, Undine began. "They were given by Louis XV to the Marquis de Chelles, who—" "Their history has been published," the visitor briefly interposed, and she coloured at her blunder. The swarthy stranger, fitting a pair of eyeglasses to a nose that was like an instrument of precision, had begun a closer and more detailed inspection of the tapestries. He seemed totally unmindful of her presence, and his air of lofty indifference was beginning to make her wish she had not sent for him. His manner in Paris had been so different. Suddenly he turned and took off the glasses, which sprang back into a fold of his clothing like retracted feelers. "Yes." He stood and looked at her without seeing her. "Very well. I have brought down a gentleman." "A gentleman?" "The greatest American collector. He buys only the best. He will not be long in Paris, and it was his only chance of coming down." Undine drew herself up. "I don't understand. I never said the tapestries were for sale." "Precisely. But this gentleman buys only things that are not for sale." It sounded dazzling, and she wavered. "I don't know. You were only to put a price on them." "Let me see him look at them first. Then I'll put a price on them." He chuckled, and without waiting for her answer, he went to the door and opened it. The gesture revealed the fur-coated back of a gentleman who stood at the opposite end of the hall, examining the bust of a 17th-century field-marshal. The dealer addressed the back respectfully. "Mr. Moffatt?" Moffatt, who appeared to be interested in the bust, glanced over his shoulder without moving. "See here." His glance took in Undine, widened to astonishment, and passed into apostrophe. "Well, if this ain't the darndest!" He came forward and took her by both hands. "Why, what on earth are you doing down here?" She laughed and blushed, in a tremor at the odd turn of the adventure. "I live here. Didn't you know?" "Not a word. Never thought of asking the party's name." He turned jovially to the bowing dealer. "Say, I told you those tapestry'd have to be out and outers to make up for the trip, but now I see I was mistaken." Undine looked at him curiously. His physical appearance was unchanged. He was as compact and ruddy as ever, with the same astute eyes, under the same guileless brow, but his self-confidence had become less aggressive, and she had never seen him so gallantly at ease. "I didn't know you'd become a great collector." "The greatest, didn't he tell you? I thought that was why I was allowed to come." She hesitated. "Of course you know the tapestries are not for sale." "That so? I thought that was only his dodge to get me down. Well, I'm glad they ain't. It'll give us more time to talk." Watch in hand, the dealer intervened. "If, nevertheless, you would first take a glance, our train—" "It ain't mine," Moffatt interrupted. "At least not if there's a later one." Undine's presence of mind had returned. "Of course there is," she said gaily. She led the way back into the gallery, half hoping the dealer would allege a pressing reason for departure. She was excited and amused at Moffatt's unexpected appearance, but humiliated that he should suspect her of being in financial straits. She never wanted to see Moffatt except when she was happy and triumphant. The dealer had followed the other two into the gallery, and there was a moment's pause while they all stood silently before the tapestries. "By George!" Moffatt finally brought out. "They're historical, you know. The king gave them to Raymond's great-great-grandfather. The other day, when I was in Paris," Undine hurried on,
I asked Mr. Fleischhauer to come down some time and tell us what they're worth, and he seems to have misunderstood, to have thought we meant to sell them." She addressed herself more pointedly to the dealer. "I'm sorry you've had the trip for nothing." Mr. Fleischhauer inclined himself eloquently. "It is not nothing to have seen such beauty." Moffatt gave him a humorous look. "I'd hate to see Mr. Fleischhauer miss his train." "I shall not miss it. I miss nothing," said Mr. Fleischhauer. He bowed to Undine and backed toward the door. "See here," Moffatt called to him as he reached the threshold. "You let the motor take you to the station, and charge up this trip to me." When the door closed he turned to Undine with a laugh. "Well, this beats the band. I thought, of course, you were living up in Paris." Again she felt a twinge of embarrassment. "Oh, French people, I mean my husband's kind, always spend a part of the year on their estates."
"But not this part, do they? Why, everything's humming up there now. I was dining at the Nouveau Luxe last night with the Driscolls and Shallums and Mrs. Rolliver, and all your old crowd were there whooping things up."
The Driscolls and Shallums and Mrs. Rolliver. How carelessly he reeled off their names! One could see from his tone that he was one of them and wanted her to know it. And nothing could have given her a completer sense of his achievement, of the number of millions he must be worth. It must have come about very recently, yet he was already at ease in his new honours. He had the metropolitan tone. While she examined him with these thoughts in her mind, she was aware of his giving her as close a scrutiny.
"But I suppose you've got your own crowd now," he continued. "You always were a lap ahead of me."
He sent his glance down the lordly length of the room.
"It's sort of funny to see you in this kind of place. But you look it. You always do look it."
She laughed. "So do you. I was just thinking it." Their eyes met. "I suppose you must be awfully rich."
He laughed too, holding her eyes. "Oh, out of sight. The consolidation set me on my feet. I own pretty near the whole of Apex. I came down to buy these tapestries for my private car."
The familiar accent of hyperbole exhilarated her. "I don't suppose I could stop you if you really wanted them."
"Nobody can stop me now if I want anything."
They were looking at each other with challenge and complicity in their eyes. His voice, his look, all the loud, confident, vigorous things he embodied and expressed, set her blood beating with curiosity. "I didn't know you and Rolliver were friends," she said.
"Oh, Jim."
His accent verged on the protective.
"Old Jim's all right. He's in Congress now. I've got to have somebody up in Washington."
He had thrust his hands in his pockets, and with his head thrown back and his lips shaped to the familiar noiseless whistle, was looking slowly and discerningly about him. Presently his eyes reverted to her face.
"So this is what I helped you to get," he said. "I've always meant to run over some day and take a look. What is it they call you? A marquise?"
She paled a little, and then flushed again. "What made you do it?" she broke out abruptly. "I've often wondered."
He laughed. "What? Lend you a hand? Why, my business instinct, I suppose. I saw you were in a tight place that time I ran across you in Paris, and I hadn't any grudge against you. Fact is, I've never had the time to nurse old scores, and if you neglect 'em they die off like goldfish."
He was still composedly regarding her.
"It's funny to think of your having settled down to this kind of life. I hope you've got what you wanted. This is a great place you live in."
"Yes, but I see a little too much of it. We live here most of the year." She had meant to give him the illusion of success, but some underlying community of instinct drew the confession from her lips.
"That so? Why on earth don't you cut it and come up to Paris?"
"Oh, Raymond's absorbed in the estates, and we haven't got the money. This place eats it all up."
"Well, that sounds aristocratic, but ain't it rather out of date? When the swells are hard up nowadays they generally chip off an heirloom."
He wheeled round again to the tapestries.
"There are a good many Paris seasons hanging right here on this wall."
"Yes, I know." She tried to check herself, to summon up a glittering equivocation, but his face, his voice, the very words he used, were like so many hammer strokes demolishing the unrealities that imprisoned her. Here was some one who spoke her language, who knew her meanings, who understood instinctively all the deep-seated wants for which her acquired vocabulary had no terms. And as she talked she once more seemed to herself intelligent, eloquent, and interesting. "Of course, it's frightfully lonely down here," she began, and through the opening made by the admission, the whole flood of her grievances poured forth. She tried to let him see that she had not sacrificed herself for nothing. She touched on the superiorities of her situation, she gilded the circumstances of which she called herself the victim, and let titles, offices, and attributes shed their utmost lustre on her tale. But what she had to boast of seemed small and tinkling compared with the evidences of his power. "Well, it's a downright shame you don't go round more," he kept saying, and she felt ashamed of her tame acceptance of her fate. When she had told her story she asked for his, and for the first time listened to it with interest. He had had what he wanted at last. The Apex Consolidation Scheme, after a long interval of suspense, had obtained its charter and shot out huge ramifications. Rolliver had stood in with him at the critical moment, and between them they had chucked out old Harmonby Driscoll bag and baggage, and got the whole town in their control. Absorbed in his theme, and forgetting her inability to follow him, Moffatt launched out on an epic recital of plot and counterplot, and she hung, a new Desdemona, on his conflict with the new anthropophagi. It was of no consequence that the details and the technicalities escaped her. She knew their meaningless syllables stood for success, and what that meant was as clear as day to her. Every Wall Street term had its equivalent in the language of Fifth Avenue, and while he talked of building up railways, she was building up palaces, and picturing all the multiple lives he would lead in them. To have things had always seemed to her the first essential of existence, and as she listened to him, the vision of the things he would have unrolled itself before her like the long triumph of an Asiatic conqueror. "And what are you going to do next?" she asked, almost breathlessly, when he had ended. "Oh, there's always a lot to do next. Business never goes to sleep." "Yes, but I mean besides business."
"Why, everything I can, I guess."
He leaned back in his chair with an air of placid power, as if he were so sure of getting what he wanted that there was no longer any use in hurrying, huge as his vistas had become. She continued to question him, and he began to talk of his growing passion for pictures and furniture, and of his desire to form a collection which should be a great representative assemblage of unmatched specimens. As he spoke, she saw his expression change, and his eyes grow younger, almost boyish, with a concentrated look in them that reminded her of long-forgotten things.
"I mean to have the best, you know. Not just to get ahead of the other fellows, but because I know it when I see it. I guess that's the only good reason,"
he concluded. And he added, looking at her with a smile,
"It was what you were always after, wasn't it?"
End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of The Custom of the Country by Edith Wharton. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Undine had gained her point, and the entresol of the Hôtel de Chelles reopened its doors for the season. Hubert and his wife, in expectation of the birth of an heir, had withdrawn to the sumptuous château which General Arlington had hired for them near Compiègne, and Undine was at least spared the sight of their bright windows and animated stairway. But she had to take her share of the felicitations which the whole far-reaching circle of friends and relations distributed to every member of Hubert's family on the approach of the happy event. Nor was this the hardest of her trials. Raymond had done what she asked. He had stood out against his mother's protests, set aside considerations of prudence, and consented to go up to Paris for 2 months, but he had done so on the understanding that during their stay they should exercise the most unremitting economy. As dinner-giving put the heaviest strain on their budget, all hospitality was suspended, and when Undine attempted to invite a few friends informally, she was warned that she could not do so without causing the gravest offence to the many others genealogically entitled to the same attention. Raymond's insistence on this rule was simply part of an elaborate and inveterate system of relations. The whole of French social life seemed to depend on the exact interpretation of that word, and Undine felt the uselessness of struggling against such mysterious inhibitions. He reminded her, however, that their inability to receive would give them all the more opportunity for going out, and he showed himself more socially disposed than in the past. But his concession did not result as she had hoped. They were asked out as much as ever, but they were asked to big dinners, to impersonal crushes, to the kind of entertainment it is a slight to be omitted from, but no compliment to be included in. Nothing could have been more galling to Undine, and she frankly bewailed the fact to Madame de Trezac. "Of course it's what was sure to come of being mewed up for months and months in the country. We're out of everything, and the people who are having a good time are simply too busy to remember us. We're only asked to things that are made up from visiting lists." Madame de Trezac listened sympathetically, but did not suppress a candid answer. "It's not altogether that, my dear. Raymond's not a man his friends forget. It's rather more, if you'll excuse my saying so, the fact of your being, you personally, in the wrong set." "The wrong set? Why, I'm in his set, the one that thinks itself too good for all the others. That's what you've always told me when I've said it bored me." "Well, that's what I mean." Madame de Trezac took the plunge. "It's not a question of your being bored." Undine coloured, but she could take the hardest thrusts where her personal interest was involved. "You mean that I'm the bore, then?" "Well, you don't work hard enough. You don't keep up. It's not that they don't admire you, your looks, I mean. They think you beautiful, they're delighted to bring you out at their big dinners with the Sèvres and the plate. But a woman has got to be something more than good-looking to have a chance to be intimate with them. She's got to know what's being said about things. I watched you the other night at the Duchess's, and half the time you hadn't an idea what they were talking about. I haven't always either, but then I have to put up with the big dinners." Undine winced under the criticism, but she had never lacked insight into the cause of her own failures, and she had already had premonitions of what Madame de Trezac so bluntly phrased. When Raymond ceased to be interested in her conversation, she had concluded it was the way of husbands, but since then it had been slowly dawning on her that she produced the same effect on others. Her entrances were always triumphs, but they had no sequel. As soon as people began to talk, they ceased to see her. Any sense of insufficiency exasperated her, and she had vague thoughts of cultivating herself, and went so far as to spend a morning in the Louvre and go to 1 or 2 lectures by a fashionable philosopher. But though she returned from these expeditions charged with opinions, their expression did not excite the interest she had hoped. Her views, if abundant, were confused, and the more she said, the more nebulous they seemed to grow. She was disconcerted, moreover, by finding that everybody appeared to know about the things she thought she had discovered, and her comments clearly produced more bewilderment than interest. Remembering the attention she had attracted on her first appearance in Raymond's world, she concluded that she had gone off, or grown dowdy, and instead of wasting more time in museums and lecture halls, she prolonged her hours at the dressmaker's, and gave up the rest of the day to the scientific cultivation of her beauty. "I suppose I've turned into a perfect frump down there in that wilderness," she lamented to Madame de Trezac, who replied inexorably, "Oh no, you're as handsome as ever, but people here don't go on looking at each other forever, as they do in London." Meanwhile financial cares became more pressing. A dunning letter from one of her tradesmen fell into Raymond's hands, and the talk it led to ended in his making clear to her that she must settle her personal debts without his aid. All the scenes about money which had disturbed her past had ended in some mysterious solution of her difficulty. Disagreeable as they were, she had always, vulgarly speaking, found they paid. But now it was she who was expected to pay. Raymond took his stand without ill-temper or apology. He simply argued from inveterate precedent. But it was impossible for Undine to understand a social organization which did not regard the indulging of woman as its first purpose, or to believe that any one taking another view was not moved by avarice or malice, and the discussion ended in mutual acrimony. The morning afterward, Raymond came into her room with a letter in his hand.
"Is this your doing?"
he asked. His look and voice expressed something she had never known before, the disciplined anger of a man trained to keep his emotions in fixed channels, but knowing how to fill them to the brim. The letter was from Mr. Fleischhauer, who begged to transmit to the Marquis de Chelles an offer for his Boucher tapestries from a client prepared to pay the large sum named on condition that it was accepted before his approaching departure for America.
"What does it mean?"
Raymond continued, as she did not speak. "How should I know? It's a lot of money," she stammered, shaken out of her self-possession. She had not expected so prompt a sequel to the dealer's visit, and she was vexed with him for writing to Raymond without consulting her. But she recognized Moffatt's high-handed way, and her fears faded in the great blaze of the sum he offered. Her husband was still looking at her.
"It was Fleischhauer who brought a man down to see the tapestries, one day when I was away at Bonn?"
He had known then. Everything was known at Saint Desert. She wavered a moment, and then gave him back his look. "Yes, it was Fleischhauer, and I sent for him."
"You sent for him?"
He spoke in a voice so veiled and repressed that he seemed to be consciously saving it for some premeditated outbreak. Undine felt its menace, but the thought of Moffatt sent a flame through her, and the words he would have spoken seemed to fly to her lips. "Why shouldn't I? Something had to be done. We can't go on as we are. I've tried my best to economize. I've scraped and scrimped and gone without heaps of things I've always had. I've moped for months and months at Saint Desert, and given up sending Paul to school because it was too expensive, and asking my friends to dine because we couldn't afford it. And you expect me to go on living like this for the rest of my life, when all you've got to do is hold out your hand and have 2,000,000 francs drop into it." Her husband stood looking at her coldly and curiously, as though she were some alien apparition his eyes had never before beheld.
"Ah, that's your answer. That's all you feel when you lay hands on things that are sacred to us."
He stopped a moment, and then let his voice break out with the volume she had felt it to be gathering.
"And you're all alike," he exclaimed. "Every one of you. You come among us from a country we don't know, and can't imagine. A country you care for so little that before you've been a day in ours you've forgotten the very house you were born in, if it wasn't torn down before you knew it. You come among us speaking our language, and not knowing what we mean, wanting the things we want, and not knowing why we want them, aping our weaknesses, exaggerating our follies, ignoring or ridiculing all we care about. You come from hotels as big as towns, and from towns as flimsy as paper, where the streets haven't had time to be named, and the buildings are demolished before they're dry, and the people are as proud of changing as we are of holding to what we have. And we're fools enough to imagine that because you copy our ways and pick up our slang, you understand anything about the things that make life decent and honorable for us."
He stopped again, his white face and drawn nostrils giving him so much the look of an extremely distinguished actor in a fine part, that, in spite of the vehemence of his emotion, his silence might have been the deliberate pause for a replique. Undine kept him waiting long enough to give the effect of having lost her cue. Then she brought out, with a little soft stare of incredulity, "Do you mean to say you're going to refuse such an offer?"
"Ah!"
He turned back from the door, and picking up the letter that lay on the table between them, tore it in pieces and tossed the pieces on the floor.
"That's how I refuse it!"
The violence of his tone and gesture made her feel as though the fluttering strips were so many lashes laid across her face, and a rage that was half fear possessed her. "How dare you speak to me like that? Nobody's ever dared to before. Is talking to a woman in that way one of the things you call decent and honorable? Now that I know what you feel about me, I don't want to stay in your house another day. And I don't mean to. I mean to walk out of it this very hour." For a moment they stood face to face, the depths of their mutual incomprehension at last bared to each other's angry eyes. Then Raymond, His glance travelling past her pointed to the fragments of paper on the floor.
"If you're capable of that, you're capable of anything," he said, as he went out of the room.
End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of The Custom of the Country by Edith Wharton. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. She watched him go in a kind of stupor, knowing that when they next met he would be as courteous and self-possessed as if nothing had happened, but that everything would nevertheless go on in the same way, in his way, and that there was no more hope of shaking his resolve or altering his point of view than there would have been of transporting the deep-rooted masonry of Saint Desert by means of the wheeled supports on which Apex architecture performed its easy transits. One of her childish rages possessed her, sweeping away every feeling save the primitive impulse to hurt and destroy, but search as she would, she could not find a crack in the strong armor of her husband's habits and prejudices. For a long time she continued to sit where he had left her, staring at the portraits on the walls as though they had joined hands to imprison her. Hitherto she had almost always felt herself a match for circumstances, but now the very dead were leagued to defeat her. People she had never seen, and whose names she couldn't even remember, seemed to be plotting and contriving against her under the escutcheoned gravestones of Saint Desert. Her eyes turned to the old warm-toned furniture beneath the pictures, and to her own idle image in the mirror above the mantelpiece. Even in that one small room there were enough things of price to buy a release from her most pressing cares, and the great house, in which the room was a mere cell, and the other greater house in Burgundy, held treasures to deplete even such a purse as Moffatt's. She liked to see such things about her. Without any real sense of their meaning, she felt them to be the appropriate setting of a pretty woman, to embody something of the rareness and distinction she had always considered she possessed, and she reflected that if she had still been Moffatt's wife he would have given her such a setting, and the power to live in it as became her. The thought sent her memory flying back to things she had turned it from for years. For the first time since their far-off weeks together, she let herself relive the brief adventure. She had been drawn to Elmer Moffatt from the first. From the day when Ben Frusk, Indiana's brother, had brought him to a church picnic at Mulvey's Grove, and he had taken instant possession of Undine, sitting in the big stage beside her on the ride to the Grove, supplanting Millard Binch, to whom she was still, though intermittently and incompletely, engaged, swinging her between the trees, rowing her on the lake, catching and kissing her in forfeits, awarding her the first prize in the beauty show he hilariously organized and gallantly carried out, and finally, no one knew how, contriving to borrow a buggy and a fast colt from old Mulvey, and driving off with her at a 2:40 gait while Millard and the others took their dust in the crawling stage. No one in Apex knew where young Moffatt had come from, and he offered no information on the subject. He simply appeared one day behind the counter in Luckaback's dollar shoe store, drifted thence to the office of Semple and Binch, the coal merchants, reappeared as the stenographer of the police court, and finally edged his way into the power-house of the Apex waterworks. He boarded with old Mrs. Flynn down in North Fifth Street, on the edge of the red-light slum. He never went to church or attended lectures, or showed any desire to improve or refine himself, but he managed to get himself invited to all the picnics and lodge sociables, and at a supper of the Phi Upsilon Society, to which he had contrived to affiliate himself, he made the best speech that had been heard there since young Jim Rolliver's first flights. The brothers of Undine's friends all pronounced him great, though he had fits of uncouthness that made the young women slower in admitting him to favour. But at the Mulvey's Grove picnic he suddenly seemed to dominate them all, and Undine, as she drove away with him, tasted the public triumph which was necessary to her personal enjoyment. After that he became a leading figure in the youthful world of Apex, and no one was surprised when the sons of Jonadab, the local temperance society, invited him to deliver their Fourth of July oration. The ceremony took place as usual in the Baptist church, and Undine, all in white, with a red rose in her breast, sat just beneath the platform, with Indiana jealously glaring at her from a less privileged seat, and poor Millard's long neck craning over the row of prominent citizens behind the orator. Elmer Moffatt had been magnificent, rolling out his alternating effects of humor and pathos, stirring his audience by moving references to the blue and the gray, convulsing them by a new version of Washington and the cherry tree, in which the infant patriot was depicted as having cut down the tree to check the deleterious spread of cherry bounce, dazzling them by his erudite allusions and apt quotations. He confessed to Undine that he had sat up half the night over Bartlett, and winding up with a peroration that drew tears from the Grand Army pensioners in the front row, and caused the minister's wife to say that many a sermon from that platform had been less uplifting. An ice-cream supper always followed the exercises, and as repairs were being made in the church basement, which was the usual scene of the festivity, the minister had offered the use of his house. The long table ran through the doorway between parlor and study, and another was set in the passage outside, with one end under the stairs. The stair-rail was wreathed in fireweed and early goldenrod, and temperance text and smilax decked the walls. When the first course had been dispatched, the young ladies, gallantly seconded by the younger of the sons, helped to ladle out and carry in the ice-cream, which stood in great pails on the larder floor, and to replenish the jugs of lemonade and coffee. Elmer Moffatt was indefatigable in performing these services, and when the minister's wife pressed him to sit down and take a mouthful himself, he modestly declined the place reserved for him among the dignitaries of the evening, and withdrew with a few chosen spirits to the dim table-end beneath the stairs. Explosions of hilarity came from this corner with increasing frequency, and now and then tumultuous rappings and howls of "Song! Song!" followed by adjurations to "Cough it up!" and "Let her go!" drowned the conversational efforts at the other table. At length the noise subsided, and the group was ceasing to attract attention, when, toward the end of the evening, the upper table, drooping under the lengthy elucubrations of the minister and the president of the Temperance Society, called on the orator of the day for a few remarks. There was an interval of scuffling and laughter beneath the stairs, and then the minister's lifted hand enjoined silence, and Elmer Moffatt got to his feet. "Step out where the ladies can hear you better, Mr. Moffatt," the minister called. Moffatt did so, steadying himself against the table, and twisting his head about as if his collar had grown too tight. But if his bearing was vacillating, his smile was unabashed, and there was no lack of confidence in the glance he threw at Undine Spragg as he began. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there's one thing I like better than another about getting drunk, and I like most everything about it except the next morning, it's the opportunity you've given me of doing it right here in the presence of the society, which, as I gather from its literature, knows more about the subject than anybody else. Ladies and gentlemen," he straightened himself, and the tablecloth slid toward him, "ever since you honored me with an invitation to address you from the temperance platform, I've been assiduously studying that literature, and I've gathered from your own evidence, what I'd strongly suspected before, that all your converted drunkards had a hell of a good time before you got at 'em, and that a good many of 'em have gone on having it since." At this point he broke off, swept the audience with his confident smile, and then, collapsing, tried to sit down on a chair that didn't happen to be there, and disappeared among his agitated supporters. There was a nightmare moment during which Undine, through the doorway, saw Ben Frusk and the others close about the fallen orator, to the crash of crockery and tumbling chairs. Then someone jumped up and shut the parlor door, and a long-necked Sunday school teacher, who had been nervously waiting his chance, and had almost given it up, rose from his feet and recited High Tide at Gettysburg amid hysterical applause. The scandal was considerable, but Moffatt, though he vanished from the social horizon, managed to keep his place in the power-house till he went off for a week, and turned up again without being able to give a satisfactory reason for his absence. After that he drifted from one job to another, now extolled for his smartness and business capacity, now dismissed in disgrace as an irresponsible loafer. His head was always full of immense nebulous schemes for the enlargement and development of any business he happened to be employed in. Sometimes his suggestions interested his employers, but proved unpractical and inapplicable. Sometimes he wore out their patience or was thought to be a dangerous dreamer. Whenever he found there was no hope of his ideas being adopted, he lost interest in the work, came late and left early, or disappeared for 2 or 3 days at a time without troubling himself to account for his absences. At last, even those who had been cynical enough to smile over his disgrace at the temperance supper began to speak of him as a hopeless failure, and he lost the support of the feminine community when one morning, just as the Baptist and Methodist churches were releasing their congregations, he walked up Eubaw Avenue with a young woman less known to those sacred edifices than to the saloons of North Fifth Street. Undine's estimate of people had always been based on their apparent power of getting what they wanted, provided it came under the category of things she understood wanting. Success was beauty and romance to her. Yet it was at the moment when Elmer Moffatt's failure was the most complete and flagrant that she suddenly felt the extent of his power. After the Eubaw Avenue scandal he had been asked not to return to the surveyor's office to which Ben Frusk had managed to get him admitted, and on the day of his dismissal he met Undine in Main Street, at the shopping hour, and sauntering up cheerfully, invited her to take a walk with him. She was about to refuse when she saw Millard Binch's mother looking at her disapprovingly from the opposite street corner. "Oh, well, I will," she said, and they walked the length of Main Street and out to the immature park in which it ended. She was in a mood of aimless discontent and unrest, tired of her engagement to Millard Binch, disappointed with Moffatt, half ashamed of being seen with him, and yet not sorry to have it known that she was independent enough to choose her companions without regard to the apex verdict. "Well, I suppose you know I'm down and out," he began, and she responded virtuously, "You must have wanted to be, or you wouldn't have behaved the way you did last Sunday." "Oh, shucks!" he sneered. "What do I care, in a one-horse place like this? If it hadn't been for you, I'd have got a move on long ago."
She did not remember afterward what else he said. She only recalled the expression of a great sweeping scorn of Apex, into which her own disdain of it was absorbed like a drop in the sea, and the affirmation of a soaring self-confidence that seemed to lift her on wings. All her own attempts to get what she wanted had come to nothing, but she had always attributed her lack of success to the fact that she had had no one to second her. It was strange that Elmer Moffatt, a shiftless outcast from even the small world she despised, should give her, in the very moment of his downfall, the sense of being able to succeed where she had failed. It was a feeling she never had in his absence, but that his nearness always instantly revived, and he seemed nearer to her now than he had ever been. They wandered on to the edge of the vague park, and sat down on a bench behind the empty bandstand.
"I went with that girl on purpose, and you know it," he broke out abruptly. "It makes me too damned sick to see Millard Binch going round looking as if he'd patented you."
"You've got no right," she interrupted, and suddenly she was in his arms, and feeling that no one had ever kissed her before. The week that followed was a big bright blur, the wildest, vividest moment of her life, and it was only 8 days later that they were in the train together, Apex and all her plans and promises behind them, and a bigger and brighter blur ahead, into which they were plunging as the Limited plunged into the sunset. Undine stood up, looking about her with vague eyes, as if she had come back from a long distance. Elmer Moffatt was still in Paris. He was in reach, within telephone call. She stood hesitating a moment. Then she went into her dressing-room, and turning over the pages of the telephone book, looked out the number of the Nouveau Luxe. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44. Of the Custom of the Country, by Edith Wharton. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Undine had been right in supposing that her husband would expect their life to go on as before. There was no appreciable change in the situation, save that he was more often absent, finding abundant reasons, agricultural and political, for frequent trips to Saint-Desert, and that, when in Paris, he no longer showed any curiosity concerning her occupations and engagements. They lived as much apart as if their cramped domicile had been a palace, and when Undine, as she now frequently did, joined the Shallums or Rollivers for a dinner at the Nouveau Luxe, or a party at a petit théâtre, she was not put to the trouble of prevaricating. Her first impulse after her scene with Raymond had been to ring up Indiana Rolliver and invite herself to dine. It chanced that Indiana, who was now in full social progress and had run over for a few weeks to get her dresses for Newport, had organized for the same evening a showy cosmopolitan banquet in which she was enchanted to include the Marquise de Chelles, and Undine, as she had hoped, found Elmer Moffatt of the party. When she drove up to the Nouveau Luxe she had not fixed on any plan of action, but once she had crossed its magic threshold her energies revived like plants in water. At last she was in her native air again, among associations she shared and conventions she understood, and all her self-confidence returned as the familiar accents uttered the accustomed things. Save for an occasional perfunctory call, she had hitherto made no effort to see her compatriots, and she noticed that Mrs. Jim Driscoll and Bertha Shallum received her with a touch of constraint, but it vanished when they remarked the cordiality of Moffatt's greeting. Her seat was at his side, and her old sense of triumph returned as she perceived the importance his notice conferred, not only in the eyes of her own party, but of the other diners. Moffatt was evidently a notable figure in all the worlds represented about the crowded tables, and Undine saw that many people who seemed personally unacquainted with him were recognizing and pointing him out. She was conscious of receiving a large share of the attention he attracted, and, bathed again in the bright air of publicity, she remembered the evening when Raymond de Chelles' first admiring glance had given her the same sense of triumph. This inopportune memory did not trouble her. She was almost grateful to Raymond for giving her the touch of superiority her compatriots clearly felt in her. It was not merely her title and her situation, but the experiences she had gained through them, that gave her this advantage over the loud, vague company. She had learned things they did not guess, shades of conduct, turns of speech, tricks of attitude, and easy and free and enviable as she thought them, she would not for the world have been back among them at the cost of knowing no more than they. Moffatt made no allusion to his visit to Saint-Desert, but when the party had regrouped itself about coffee and liqueurs on the terrace, he bent over to ask confidentially, "What about my tapestries?" She replied in the same tone, "You oughtn't to have let Fleischhauer write that letter. My husband's furious." He seemed honestly surprised. "Why? Didn't I offer him enough?" "He's furious that anyone should offer anything. I thought when he found out what they were worth he might be tempted, but he'd rather see me starve than part with one of his grandfather's snuff-boxes."
Well, he knows now what the tapestries are worth. I offered more than Fleischhauer advised.
"Yes, but you were in too much of a hurry."
I've got to be. I'm going back next week."
She felt her eyes cloud with disappointment. "Oh, why do you? I hoped you might stay on." They looked at each other uncertainly a moment. Then he dropped his voice to say,
Even if I did, I probably shouldn't see anything of you.
"Why not? Why won't you come and see me? I've always wanted to be friends." He came the next day and found in her drawing-room two ladies whom she introduced as her sisters-in-law. The ladies lingered on for a long time, sipping their tea stiffly and exchanging low-voiced remarks while Undine talked with Moffatt, and when they left, with small sidelong bows in his direction, Undine exclaimed, "Now you see how they all watch me." She began to go into the details of her married life, drawing on the experiences of the first months for instances that scarcely applied to her present liberated state. She could thus, without great exaggeration, picture herself as entrapped into a bondage hardly conceivable to Moffatt, and she saw him redden with excitement as he listened.
I call it darned low. Darned low," he broke in at intervals.
"Of course I go round more now.
she concluded. "I mean to see my friends. I don't care what he says."
"What can he say?"
"Oh, he despises Americans. They all do."
"Well, I guess we can still sit up and take nourishment."
They laughed, and slipped back to talking of earlier things. She urged him to put off his sailing. There were so many things they might do together, sightseeing and excursions, and she could perhaps show him some of the private collections he hadn't seen, the ones it was hard to get admitted to. This instantly roused his attention, and after naming one or two collections he had already seen, she hit on one he had found inaccessible and was particularly anxious to visit.
"There's an Ingres there that's one of the things I came over to have a look at, but I was told there was no use trying."
"Oh, I can easily manage it. The Duke's Raymond's uncle." It gave her a peculiar satisfaction to say it. She felt as though she were taking a surreptitious revenge on her husband. "But he's down in the country this week," she continued, "and no one, not even the family, is allowed to see the pictures when he's away. Of course his Ingres are the finest in France." She ran it off glibly, though a year ago she had never heard of the painter, and did not even now remember whether he was an old master or one of the very new ones whose names one hadn't had time to learn. Moffatt put off sailing, saw the Duke's Ingres under her guidance, and accompanied her to various other private galleries inaccessible to strangers. She had lived in almost total ignorance of such opportunities, but now that she could use them to advantage, she showed a surprising quickness in picking up tips, ferreting out rare things, and getting a sight of hidden treasures. She even acquired as much of the jargon as a pretty woman needs to produce the impression of being well informed, and Moffatt's sailing was more than once postponed. They saw each other almost daily, for she continued to come and go as she pleased, and Raymond showed neither surprise nor disapproval. When they were asked to family dinners, she usually excused herself at the last moment on the plea of a headache, and calling up Indiana or Bertha Shallum, improvised a little party at the Nouveau Luxe, and on other occasions she accepted such invitations as she chose, without mentioning to her husband where she was going. In this world of lavish pleasures she lost what little prudence the discipline of Saint Desert had inculcated. She could never be with people who had all the things she envied, without being hypnotized into the belief that she had only to put her hand out to obtain them, and all the unassuaged rancors and hungers of her early days in West End Avenue came back with increased acuity. She knew her want so much better now, and was so much more worthy of the things she wanted. She had given up hoping that her father might make another hit in Wall Street. Mr. Spragg's letters gave the impression that the days of big strokes were over for her husband, that he had gone down in the conflict with forces beyond his measure. If he had remained in Apex, the tide of its new prosperity might have carried him to wealth, but New York's huge waves of success had submerged instead of floating him, and Rolliver's enmity was a hand perpetually stretched out to strike him lower. At most, Mr. Spragg's tenacity would keep him at the level he now held, and though he and his wife had still further simplified their way of living, Undine understood that their self-denial would not increase her opportunities. She felt no compunction in continuing to accept an undiminished allowance. It was the hereditary habit of the parent animal to despoil himself for his progeny. But this conviction did not seem incompatible with a sentimental pity for her parents. Aside from all interested motives, she wished for their own sakes that they were better off. Their personal requirements were pathetically limited, but renewed prosperity would at least have procured them the happiness of giving her what she wanted. Moffatt lingered on, but he began to speak more definitely of sailing, and Undine foresaw the day when, strong as her attraction was, stronger influences would snap it like a thread. She knew she interested and amused him, and that it flattered his vanity to be seen with her, and to hear that rumour coupled their names. But he gave her, more than anyone she had ever known, the sense of being detached from his life, in control of it, and able, without weakness or uncertainty, to choose which of its calls he should obey. If the call were that of business, of any of the great perilous affairs he handled like a snake-charmer spinning the deadly reptiles about his head, she knew she would drop from his life like a loosened leaf. These anxieties sharpened the intensity of her enjoyment,
and made the contrast keener between her crowded, sparkling hours and the vacant months at Saint Desert. Little as she understood of the qualities that made Moffatt what he was, the results were of the kind most palpable to her. He used life exactly as she would have used it in his place. Some of his enjoyments were beyond her range, but even these appealed to her because of the money that was required to gratify them. When she took him to see some inaccessible picture, or went with him to inspect the treasures of a famous dealer, she saw that the things he looked at moved him in a way she could not understand, and that the actual touching of rare textures, bronze or marble, or velvets flushed with the bloom of age, gave him sensations like those her own beauty had once roused in him. But the next moment he was laughing over some commonplace joke, or absorbed in a long cipher cable handed to him as they re-entered the Nouveau Luxe for tea, and his aesthetic emotions had been thrust back into their compartment of the great steel strong-box of his mind. Her new life went on without comment or interference from her husband, and she saw that he had accepted their altered relation, and intended merely to keep up an external semblance of harmony. To that semblance she knew he attached intense importance. It was an article of his complicated social creed that a man of his class should appear to live on good terms with his wife. For different reasons it was scarcely less important to Undine. She had no wish to affront again the social reprobation that had so nearly wrecked her. But she could not keep up the life she was leading without more money, a great deal more money, and the thought of contracting her expenditure was no longer tolerable. One afternoon, several weeks later, she came in to find a tradesman's representative waiting with a bill. There was a noisy scene in the ante-room before the man threateningly withdrew, a scene witnessed by the servants and overheard by her mother-in-law, whom she found seated in the drawing-room when she entered. The old marquise's visits to her daughter-in-law were made at long intervals, but with ritual regularity. She called every other Friday at 5, and Undine had forgotten that she was due that day. This did not make for greater cordiality between them, and the altercation in the ante-room had been too loud for concealment. The marquise was on her feet when her daughter-in-law came in, and instantly said with lowered eyes, "It would perhaps be best for me to go." "Oh, I don't care. You're welcome to tell Raymond you've heard me insulted because I'm too poor to pay my bills. He knows it well enough already." The words broke from Undine unguardedly, but once spoken they nourished her defiance. "I am sure my son has frequently recommended greater prudence," the marquise murmured. "Yes, it's a pity he didn't recommend it to your other son instead. All the money I was entitled to has gone to pay Hubert's debts." "Raymond has told me there are certain things you fail to understand. I have no wish whatever to discuss them." The marquise had gone toward the door. With her hand on it she paused to add, "I shall say nothing whatever of what has happened." Her icy magnanimity added the last touch to Undine's wrath. They knew her extremity, one and all, and it did not move them. At most, they would join in concealing it like a blot on their honor. And the menace grew and mounted, and not a hand was stretched to help her. Hardly a half-hour earlier, Moffatt, with whom she had been visiting a private view, had sent her home in his motor with the excuse that he must hurry back to the Nouveau Luxe to meet his stenographer and sign a batch of letters for the New York mail. It was therefore probable that he was still at home, that she should find him if she hastened there at once. An overwhelming desire to cry out her wrath and wretchedness brought her to her feet and sent her down to hail a passing cab. As it whirled her through the bright streets powdered with amber sunlight, her brain throbbed with confused intentions. She did not think of Moffatt as a power she could use, but simply as someone who knew her and understood her grievance. It was essential to her at that moment to be told that she was right, and that every one opposed to her was wrong. At the hotel she asked his number, and was carried up in the lift. On the landing she paused a moment, disconcerted. It had occurred to her that he might not be alone. But she walked on quickly, found the number, and knocked. Moffatt opened the door, and she glanced beyond him and saw that the big, bright sitting-room was empty. "Hullo!" he exclaimed, surprised, and as he stood aside to let her enter, she saw him draw out his watch and glance at it surreptitiously. He was expecting someone, or he had an engagement elsewhere. Something claimed him from which she was excluded. The thought flushed her with sudden resolution. She knew now what she had come for, to keep him from everyone else, to keep him for herself alone. "Don't send me away," she said, and laid her hand on his beseechingly. Chapter 44. Chapter 45 of The Custom of the Country by Edith Wharton. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. She advanced into the room, and slowly looked about her. The big, vulgar writing table wreathed in bronze was heaped with letters and papers. Among them stood a lapis bowl in a Renaissance mounting of enamel, and a vase of Phoenician glass that was like a bit of rainbow caught in cobwebs. On a table against the window a little Greek marble lifted its pure lines. On every side some rare and sensitive object seemed to be shrinking back from the false colors and crude contours of the hotel furniture. There were no books in the room, but the florid console under the mirror was stacked with old numbers of Town Talk and the New York Radiator. Undine recalled the dingy hall-room that Moffatt had lodged in at Mrs. Flynn's, over Hober's livery stable, and her heart beat at the signs of his altered state. When her eyes came back to him, their lids were moist. "Don't send me away," she repeated. He looked at her and smiled. "What is it? What's the matter?" "I don't know, but I had to come. Today, when you spoke again of sailing, I felt as if I couldn't stand it." She lifted her eyes and looked in his profoundly. He reddened a little under her gaze, but she could detect no softening or confusion in the shrewd, steady glance he gave her back. "Things going wrong again? Is that the trouble?" he merely asked, with a comforting inflection. "They always are wrong. It's all been an awful mistake. But I shouldn't care if you were here and I could see you sometimes. You're so strong. That's what I feel about you, Elmer. I was the only one to feel it that time they all turned against you out at Apex. Do you remember the afternoon I met you down on Main Street and we walked out together to the park? I knew then that you were stronger than any of them." She had never spoken more sincerely. For the moment all thought of self-interest was in abeyance, and she felt again, as she had felt that day, the instinctive yearning of her nature to be one with his. Something in her voice must have attested it, for she saw a change in his face. "You're not the beauty you were," he said irrelevantly, "but you're a lot more fetching." The oddly qualified praise made her laugh with mingled pleasure and annoyance. "I suppose I must be dreadfully changed." "You're all right. But I've got to go back home," he broke off abruptly. "I've put it off too long." She paled and looked away, helpless in her sudden disappointment. "I knew you'd say that. And I shall just be left here." She sat down on the sofa near which they had been standing, and 2 tears formed on her lashes and fell. Moffatt sat down beside her, and both were silent. She had never seen him at a loss before. She made no attempt to draw nearer, or to use any of the arts of cajolery, but presently she said, without rising, "I saw you look at your watch when I came in. I suppose somebody else is waiting for you."
"It doesn't matter."
"Some other woman?"
"It doesn't matter."
"I've wondered so often, but of course I've got no right to ask." She stood up slowly, understanding that he meant to let her go. "Just tell me one thing. Did you never miss me?"
"Oh, damnably!"
he brought out with sudden bitterness. She came nearer, sinking her voice to a low whisper. "It's the only time I ever really cared. All through." He had risen too, and they stood intensely gazing at each other. Moffatt's face was fixed and grave, as she had seen it in hours she now found herself rapidly reliving.
"I believe you did," he said.
Oh, Elmer, if I'd known, if I'd only known!" He made no answer, and she turned away, touching with an unconscious hand the edge of the lapis bowl among his papers. "Elmer, if you're going away, it can't do any harm to tell me. Is there anyone else?"
He gave a laugh that seemed to shake him free. "In that kind of way? Lord, no. Too busy."
She came close again, and laid a hand on his shoulder. "Then why shouldn't we—" She leaned her head back so that her gaze slanted up through her wet lashes. "I can do as I please. My husband does. They think so differently about marriage over here. It's just a business contract. As long as a woman doesn't make a show of herself, no one cares." She put her other hand up, so that she held him facing her. "I've always felt, all through everything, that I belonged to you." Moffatt left her hands on his shoulders, but did not lift his own to clasp them. For a moment she thought she had mistaken him, and a leaden sense of shame descended on her. Then he asked,
"You say your husband goes with other women?"
Lily Estradina's taunt flashed through her, and she seized on it. "People have told me so. His own relations have. I've never stooped to spy on him."
"And the women in your set? I suppose it's taken for granted they all do the same."
She laughed.
"Everything fixed up for them, same as it is for the husbands, eh? Nobody meddles or makes trouble if you know the ropes."
"No, nobody. It's all quite easy." She stopped, her faint smile checked, as his backward movement made her hands drop from his shoulders.
"And that's what you're proposing to me? That you and I should do like the rest of 'em?"
His face had lost its comic roundness, and grown harsh and dark, as it had when her father had taken her away from him at Opaque. He turned on his heel, walked the length of the room, and halted with his back to her in the embrasure of the window. There he paused a full minute, his hands in his pockets, staring out at the perpetual interweaving of motors in the luminous setting of the square. Then he turned and spoke from where he stood.
"Look here, Undine. If I'm to have you again, I don't want to have you that way. That time out in Apex, when everybody in the place was against me, and I was down and out, you stood up to them and stuck by me. Remember that walk down Main Street? Don't I? And the way the people glared and hurried by, and how you kept on alongside of me, talking and laughing and looking your Sunday best? When Abner Spragg came out to Opaque after us and pulled you back, I was pretty sore at your deserting. But I came to see it was natural enough. You were only a spoilt girl, used to having everything you wanted. And I couldn't give you a thing then, and the folks you'd been taught to believe in all told you I never would. Well, I did look like a back number, and no blame to you for thinking so. I used to say it to myself over and over again, laying awake nights and totting up my mistakes. And then there were days when the wind set another way, and I knew I'd pull it off yet, and I thought you might have held on."
He stopped, his head a little lowered, his concentrated gaze on her flushed face.
"Well, anyhow," he broke out, "you were my wife once, and you were my wife first. And if you want to come back you've got to come that way. Not slink through the back way when there's no one watching, but walk in by the front door, with your head up and your Main Street look."
Since the days when he had poured out to her his great fortune-building projects, she had never heard him make so long a speech, and her heart, as she listened, beat with a new joy and terror. It seemed to her that the great moment of her life had come at last, the moment all her minor failures and successes had been building up with blind, indefatigable hands. "Elmer, Elmer!" she sobbed out. She expected to find herself in his arms, shut in and shielded from all her troubles, but he stood his ground across the room, immovable.
"Is it yes?"
She faltered the word after him. "Yes."
"Are you going to marry me?"
She stared, bewildered. "Why, Elmer, marry you?
You forget."
Forget what? That you don't want to give up what you've got?
"How can I? Such things are not done out here. Why, I'm a Catholic, in the Catholic Church—" She broke off, reading the end in his face. "But later, perhaps, things might change. Oh, Elmer, if only you'd stay over here and let me see you sometimes."
Yes, the way your friends see each other. We're differently made out in Apex. When I want that sort of thing, I go down to North Fifth Street for it."
She paled under the retort, but her heart beat high with it. What he asked was impossible, and she gloried in his asking it. Feeling her power, she tried to temporize. "At least if you stayed we could be friends. I shouldn't feel so terribly alone."
He laughed impatiently. "Don't talk magazine stuff to me, Undine Spragg. I guess we want each other the same way, only our ideas are different. You've got all muddled living out here among a lot of loafers who call it a career to run round after every petticoat. I've got my job out at home, and I belong where my job is."
"Are you going to be tied to business all your life?" Her smile was faintly depreciatory.
I guess business is tied to me. Wall Street act as if it couldn't get along without me."
He gave his shoulders a shake, and moved a few steps nearer.
"See here, Undine. You're the one that don't understand. If I was to sell out tomorrow and spend the rest of my life reading art magazines in a pink villa, I wouldn't do what you're asking me. And I've about as much idea of dropping business as you have of taking to district nursing. There are things a man doesn't do. I understand why your husband won't sell those tapestries, till he's got to. His ancestors are his business. Wall Street's mine."
He paused, and they silently faced each other. Undine made no attempt to approach him. She understood that if he yielded, it would be only to recover his advantage and deepen her feeling of defeat. She put out her hand and took up the sunshade she had dropped on entering. "I suppose it's good-bye, then," she said.
"You haven't got the nerve."
"The nerve for what?"
"To come where you belong. With me."
She laughed a little, and then sighed. She wished he would come nearer, or look at her differently. She felt, under his cool eye, no more compelling than a woman of wax in a showcase. "How could I get a divorce? With my religion—"
Why, you were born a Baptist, weren't you? That's where you used to attend church when I waited round the corner Sunday mornings, with one of old Hober's buggies."
They both laughed, and he went on.
"If you'll come along home with me, I'll see you get your divorce all right. Who cares what they do over here? You're an American, ain't you? What you want is the home-made article."
She listened, discouraged yet fascinated by his sturdy inaccessibility to all her arguments and objections. He knew what he wanted, saw his road before him, and acknowledged no obstacles. Her defense was drawn from reasons he did not understand, or based on difficulties that did not exist for him. And gradually she felt herself yielding to the steady pressure of his will. Yet the reasons he brushed away came back with redoubled tenacity whenever he paused long enough for her to picture the consequences of what he exacted. "You don't know, you don't understand," she kept repeating. But she knew that his ignorance was part of his terrible power, and that it was hopeless to try to make him feel the value of what he was asking her to give up.
"See here, Undine,"
he said slowly, as if he measured her resistance though he couldn't fathom it.
"I guess it had better be yes or no right here. It ain't going to do either of us any good to drag this thing out. If you want to come back to me, come. If you don't, we'll shake hands on it now. I'm due in Apex for a directors' meeting on the 20th, and as it is, I'll have to cable for a special to get me out there. No, no, don't cry. It ain't that kind of a story. But I'll have a deck suite for you on the Semantic if you'll sail with me the day after tomorrow."
End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of The Custom of the Country by Edith Wharton. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. In the great high-ceilinged library of a private hotel
overlooking one of the new quarters of Paris, Paul Marvell stood listlessly gazing out into the twilight. The trees were budding symmetrically along the avenue below, and Paul, looking down, saw, between windows and tree-tops, a pair of tall iron gates with gilt ornaments, the marble curb of a semicircular drive, and bands of spring flowers set in turf. He was now a big boy of nearly 9, who went to a fashionable private school, and he had come home that day for the Easter holidays. He had not been back since Christmas, and it was the first time he had seen the new hôtel which his stepfather had bought, and in which Mr. and Mrs. Moffatt had hastily established themselves, a few weeks earlier, on their return from a flying trip to America. They were always coming and going. During the 2 years since their marriage they had been perpetually dashing over to New York and back, or rushing down to Rome, or up to the Engadine. Paul never knew where they were going, except when a telegram announced that they were going somewhere else. He did not even know that there was any method of communication between mothers and sons less laconic than that of the electric wire, and once, when a boy at school asked him if his mother often wrote, he had answered, in all sincerity, "Oh yes, I got a telegram last week." He had been almost sure, as sure as he ever was of anything, that he should find her at home when he arrived, but a message, for she hadn't had time to telegraph, apprised him that she and Mr. Moffatt had run down to Deauville to look at a house they thought of hiring for the summer. They were taking an early train back, and would be at home for dinner, were in fact having a lot of people to dine. It was just what he ought to have expected, and had been used to ever since he could remember, and generally he didn't mind much, especially since his mother had become Mrs. Moffatt, and the father he had been most used to and liked best had abruptly disappeared from his life. But the new hôtel was big and strange, and his own room, in which there was not a toy or a book, or one of his dear battered relics, none of the new servants, they were always new, could find his things or think where they had been put, seemed the loneliest spot in the whole house. He had gone up there after his solitary luncheon, served in the immense marble dining-room by a footman on the same scale, and had tried to occupy himself with pasting postcards into his album. But the newness and sumptuousness of the room embarrassed him. The white fur rugs and brocade chairs seemed maliciously on the watch for smears and ink spots, and after a while he pushed the album aside and began to roam through the house. He went to all the rooms in turn, his mother's first, the wonderful lacy bedroom, all pale silks and velvets, artful mirrors and veiled lamps, and the boudoir as big as a drawing-room, with pictures he would have liked to know about, and tables and cabinets holding things he was afraid to touch. Mr. Moffatt's rooms came next. They were soberer and darker, but as big and splendid. And in the bedroom, on the brown wall, hung a single picture, the portrait of a boy in grey velvet, that interested Paul most of all. The boy's hand rested on the head of a big dog, and he looked infinitely noble and charming, and yet, in spite of the dog, so sad and lonely that he too might have come home that very day to a strange house in which none of his old things could be found. From these rooms Paul wandered downstairs again. The library attracted him most. There were rows and rows of books, bound in dim browns and golds, and old faded reds as rich as velvet. They all looked as if they might have had stories in them as splendid as their bindings. But the bookcases were closed with gilt trellising, and when Paul reached up to open one, a servant told him that Mr. Moffatt's secretary kept them locked because the books were too valuable to be taken down. This seemed to make the library as strange as the rest of the house, and he passed on to the ballroom at the back. Through its closed doors he heard a sound of hammering, and when he tried the door handle, a servant passing with a tray full of glasses told him that they hadn't finished, and wouldn't let anybody in. The mysterious pronoun somehow increased Paul's sense of isolation, and he went on to the drawing-rooms, steering his way prudently between the gold armchairs and shining tables, and wondering whether the wigged and corseleted heroes on the walls represented Mr. Moffatt's ancestors, and why, if they did, he looked so little like them. The dining-room beyond was more amusing, because busy servants were already laying the long table. It was too early for the florist, and the centre of the table was empty. but down the sides were gold baskets heaped with pulpy summer fruits, figs, strawberries, and big blushing nectarines. Between them stood crystal decanters with red and yellow wine, and little dishes full of sweets, and against the walls were sideboards with great pieces of gold and silver, ewers and urns and branching candelabra, which sprinkled the green marble walls with star-like reflections. After a while he grew tired of watching the coming and going of white-sleeved footmen, and of listening to the butler's vociferated orders, and strayed back into the library. The habit of solitude had given him a passion for the printed page, and if he could have found a book anywhere, any kind of book, he would have forgotten the long hours and the empty house. But the tables in the library held only massive unused inkstands and immense immaculate blotters. Not a single volume had slipped its golden prison. His loneliness had grown overwhelming, and he suddenly thought of Mrs. Heeny's clippings. His mother, alarmed by an insidious gain in weight, had brought the masseuse back from New York with her, and Mrs. Heeny, with her old black bag and waterproof, was established in one of the grand bedrooms lined with mirrors. She had been loud in her joy at seeing her little friend that morning, but 4 years had passed since their last parting, and her personality had grown remote to him. He saw too many people, and they too often disappeared and were replaced by others. His scattered affections had ended by concentrating themselves on the charming image of the gentleman he called his French father, and since his French father had vanished, no one else seemed to matter much to him. "Oh, well," Mrs. Heeny had said, discerning the reluctance under his civil greeting, "I guess you're as strange here as I am, and we're both pretty strange to each other. You just go and look round and see what a lovely home your ma's got to live in, and when you get tired of that, come up here to me, and I'll give you a look at my clippings." The word woke a train of dormant associations, and Paul saw himself seated on a dingy carpet, between two familiar taciturn old presences, while he rummaged in the depths of a bag stuffed with strips of newspaper. He found Mrs. Heeny sitting in a pink armchair, her bonnet perched on a pink-shaded electric lamp, and her numerous implements spread out on an immense pink toilet table. Vague as his recollection of her was, she gave him at once a sense of reassurance that nothing else in the house conveyed, and after he had examined all her scissors and pastes and nail-polishers, he turned to the bag, which stood on the carpet at her feet, as if she were waiting for a train. My," she said, "do you want to get into that again? How you used to hunt in it for taffy, to be sure, when your pa brought you up to Grandma Spragg's o' Saturdays. Well, I'm afraid there ain't any taffy in it now, but there's piles and piles of lovely new clippings you ain't seen."
My papa? He paused, his hand among the strips of newspaper. My papa never saw my Grandma Spragg. He never went to America.
"Never went to America? Your pa never? Why, land alive!"
Mrs. Heeny gasped, a blush empurpling her large, warm face.
"Why, Paul Marvell! Don't you remember your own father, you that bear his name?" she exclaimed.
The boy blushed also, conscious that it must have been wrong to forget, and yet not seeing how he was to blame. That one died a long time ago, didn't he? I was thinking of my French father, he explained.
"Oh, mercy!"
ejaculated Mrs. Heeny, and as if to cut the conversation short, she stooped over, creaking like a ship, and thrust her plump strong hand into the bag.
"Here, now, just you look at these clippings. I guess you'll find a lot in them about your ma. Where do they come from? Why, out of the papers, of course," she added, in response to Paul's inquiry. "You'd oughter start a scrapbook yourself. You're plenty old enough. You could make a beauty just about your ma, with her picture pasted in the front, and another about Mr. Moffat and his collections. There's one I cut out the other day that says he's the greatest collector in America."
Paul listened, fascinated. He had the feeling that Mrs. Heeny's clippings, aside from their great intrinsic interest, might furnish him the clue to many things he didn't understand, and that nobody had ever had time to explain to him. His mother's marriages, for instance. He was sure there was a great deal to find out about them. But she always said, "I'll tell you about it when I come back." And when she came back, it was invariably to rush off somewhere else. So he had remained without a key to her transitions, and had had to take for granted numberless things that seemed to have no parallel in the experience of the other boys he knew.
Here it is,"
said Mrs. Heeny, adjusting the big tortoise-shell spectacles she had taken to wearing, and reading out in a slow chant that seemed to Paul to come out of some lost remoteness of his infancy.
"It is reported in London that the price paid by Mr. Elmer Moffatt for the celebrated Grey boy is the largest sum ever given for a Van Dyck. Since Mr. Moffatt began to buy extensively, it is estimated in art circles that values have gone up at least 75%.
But the price of the Grey boy did not interest Paul, and he said, a little impatiently, "I'd rather hear about my mother."
To be sure you would. You wait now."
Mrs. Heeny made another dive, and again began to spread her clippings on her lap, like cards on a big black table.
"Here's one about her last portrait. No, here's a better one about her pearl necklace, the one Mr. Moffatt gave her last Christmas. The necklace, which was formerly the property of an Austrian archduchess, is composed of 500 perfectly matched pearls that took 30 years to collect. It is estimated among dealers in precious stones that since Mr. Moffatt began to buy, the price of pearls has gone up over 50%.
Even this did not fix Paul's attention. He wanted to hear about his mother and Mr. Moffatt, and not about their things, and he didn't quite know how to frame his question. But Mrs. Heeny looked kindly at him, and he tried. "Why is mother married to Mr. Moffatt now?"
Why, you must know that much, Paul."
Mrs. Heeny again looked warm and worried.
"She's married to him because she got a divorce. That's why."
And suddenly she had another inspiration.
"Didn't she ever send you over any of those splendid clippings that came out the time they were married? Why, I declare that's a shame, but I must have some of 'em right here."
She dived again, shuffled, sorted, and pulled out a long, discolored strip.
"I've carried this round with me ever since, and so many's wanted to read it it's all torn."
She smoothed out the paper and began.
"Divorce and remarriage of Mrs. Undine Spragg de Chelles. American Marquise renounces ancient French title to wed railroad king. Quick work untying and tying. Boy and girl romance renewed. Reno, November 23rd. The Marquise de Chelles of Paris, France, formerly Mrs. Undine Spragg Marvell of Apex City and New York, got a decree of divorce at a special session of the court last night, and was remarried 15 minutes later to Mr. Elmer Moffatt, the billionaire railroad king, who was the Marquise's first husband. No case has ever been railroaded through the divorce courts of this state at a higher rate of speed. As Mr. Moffatt said last night before he and his bride jumped onto their eastbound special, every record has been broken. It was just 6 months ago yesterday that the present Mrs. Moffatt came to Reno to look for her divorce. Owing to a delayed train, her counsel was late yesterday in receiving some necessary papers, and it was feared the decision would have to be held over. But Judge Toomey, who was a personal friend of Mr. Moffatt's, held a night session and rushed it through, so that the happy couple could have the knot tied and board their special in time for Mrs. Moffatt to spend Thanksgiving in New York with her aged parents. The hearing began at 7:10 p.m., and at 8 o'clock the bridal couple were steaming out of the station. At the trial, Mrs. Spragg de Chelles, who wore copper velvet and sables, gave evidence as to the brutality of her French husband, but she had to talk fast as time pressed, and Judge Toomey wrote the entry at top speed, and then jumped into a motor with the happy couple and drove to the Justice of the Peace, where he acted as best man to the bridegroom. The latter is said to be one of the 6 wealthiest men east of the Rockies. His gifts to the bride are a necklace and tiara of pigeon blood rubies belonging to Queen Marie Antoinette, a $1 million check, and a house in New York. The happy pair will pass the honeymoon in Mrs. Moffatt's new home, 5009 Fifth Avenue, which is an exact copy of the Pitti Palace, Florence. They plan to spend their springs in France."
Mrs. Heeny drew a long breath, folded the paper, and took off her spectacles.
"There,"
she said, with a benignant smile and a tap of Paul's cheek.
"Now you see how it all happened."
Paul was not sure he did, but he made no answer. His mind was too full of troubled thoughts. In the dazzling description of his mother's latest nuptials, one fact alone stood out for him, that she had said things that weren't true of his French father. something he had half guessed in her, and averted his frightened thoughts from, took his little heart in an iron grasp. She said things that weren't true. That was what he had always feared to find out. She had got up and said before a lot of people things that were awfully false about his dear French father. The sound of a motor turning in at the gates made Mrs. Heeny exclaim, "Here they are!" and a moment later Paul heard his mother calling to him. He got up reluctantly, and stood wavering till he felt Mrs. Heeny's astonished eye upon him. Then he heard Mr. Moffatt's jovial shout of "Paul Marvell, ahoy there!" and roused himself to run downstairs. As he reached the landing, he saw that the ballroom doors were open and all the lustres lit. His mother and Mr. Moffatt stood in the middle of the shining floor, looking up at the walls. And Paul's heart gave a wondering bound, for there, set in great gilt panels, were the tapestries that had always hung in the gallery at Saint Desert.
"Well, Senator, it feels good to shake your fist again,"
his stepfather said, taking him in a friendly grasp, and his mother, who looked handsomer and taller and more splendidly dressed than ever, exclaimed, "Mercy, how they've cut his hair!" before she bent to kiss him. "Oh, mother, mother!" he burst out, feeling, between his mother's face and the others, hardly less familiar on the walls, that he was really at home again, and not in a strange house. "Gracious, how you squeeze!" she protested, loosening his arms. "But you look splendidly, and how you've grown!" She turned away from him and began to inspect the tapestries critically. "Somehow they look smaller here," she said, with a tinge of disappointment. Mr. Moffatt gave a slight laugh and walked slowly down the room, as if to study its effect. As he turned back, his wife said, "I didn't think you'd ever get them." He laughed again, more complacently.
"Well, I don't know as I ever should have, if General Arlington hadn't happened to bust up."
They both smiled, and Paul, seeing his mother's softened face, stole his hand in hers and began, "Mother, I took a prize in composition." "Did you? You must tell me about it tomorrow. No, I really must rush off and dress. I haven't even placed the dinner cards." She freed her hand, and as she turned to go, Paul heard Mr. Moffatt say,
"Can't you ever give him a minute's time, Undine?"
She made no answer, but sailed through the door with her head high, as she did when anything annoyed her. And Paul and his stepfather stood alone in the illuminated ballroom. Mr. Moffatt smiled good-naturedly at the little boy, and then turned back to the contemplation of the hangings.
"I guess you know where these came from, don't you?"
he asked, in a tone of satisfaction. "Oh, yes," Paul answered eagerly, with a hope he dared not utter, that since the tapestries were there, his French father might be coming too.
"You're a smart boy to remember them. I don't suppose you ever thought you'd see them here?"
"I don't know," said Paul, embarrassed.
"Well, I guess you wouldn't have if their owner hadn't been in a pretty tight place. It was like drawing teeth for him to let them go."
Paul flushed up, and again the iron grasp was on his heart. He hadn't hitherto actually disliked Mr. Moffatt, who was always in a good humour, and seemed less busy and absent-minded than his mother, but at that instant he felt a rage of hate for him. He turned away and burst into tears.
"Why, hullo, old chap! Why, what's up?"
Mr. Moffatt was on his knees beside the boy, and the arms embracing him were firm and friendly. But Paul, for the life of him, couldn't answer. He could only sob and sob as the great surges of loneliness broke over him.
"Is it because your mother hadn't time for you? Well, she's like that, you know, and you and I have got to lump it,"
Mr. Moffatt continued, getting to his feet. He stood looking down at the boy with a queer smile.
"If we two chaps stick together, it won't be so bad. We can keep each other warm, don't you see? I like you first rate, you know. When you're big enough, I mean to put you in my business. And it looks as if one of these days you'd be the richest boy in America."
The lamps were lit, the vases full of flowers, the footmen assembled on the landing and in the vestibule below, when Undine descended to the drawing-room. As she passed the ballroom door, she glanced in approvingly at the tapestries.
They really looked better than she had been willing to admit. They made her ballroom the handsomest in Paris. But something had put her out on the way up from Deauville, and the simplest way of easing her nerves had been to affect indifference to the tapestries. Now she had quite recovered her good humor, and as she glanced down the list of guests she was awaiting she said to herself, with a sigh of satisfaction, that she was glad she had put on her rubies. For the first time since her marriage to Moffatt, she was about to receive in her house the people she most wished to see there. The beginnings had been a little difficult. Their first attempt in New York was so unpromising that she feared they might not be able to live down the sensational details of their reunion, and had insisted on her husband's taking her back to Paris. But her apprehensions were unfounded. It was only necessary to give people the time to pretend they had forgotten, and already they were all pretending beautifully. The French world had of course held out longest. It had strongholds she might never capture. But already seceders were beginning to show themselves, and her dinner list that evening was graced with the names of an authentic duke and a not too damaged countess. In addition, of course, she had the Shallums, the Chauncey Ellings, May Beringer, Dicky Bowles, Walsingham Popple, and the rest of the New York frequenters of the Nouveau Luxe. She had even, at the last minute, had the amusement of adding Peter Van Degen to their number. In the evening there were to be Spanish dancing and Russian singing, and Dicky Bowles had promised her a Grand Duke for her next dinner, if she could secure the new tenor who always refused to sing in private houses. Even now, however, she was not always happy. She had everything she wanted, but she still felt, at times, that there were other things she might want if she knew about them. And there had been moments lately when she had had to confess to herself that Moffatt did not fit into the picture. At first she had been dazzled by his success and subdued by his authority. He had given her all she had ever wished for, and more than she had ever dreamed of having. He had made up to her for all her failures and blunders, and there were hours when she still felt his dominion and exulted in it. But there were others when she saw his defects and was irritated by them, when his loudness and redness, his misplaced joviality, his familiarity with the servants, his alternating swagger and ceremony with her friends, jarred on perceptions that had developed in her unawares. Now and then she caught herself thinking that his two predecessors, who were gradually becoming merged in her memory, would have said this or that differently, behaved otherwise in such and such a case. And the comparison was almost always to Moffatt's disadvantage. This evening, however, she thought of him indulgently. She was pleased with his clever stroke in capturing the Saint Desert tapestries, which General Arlington's sudden bankruptcy and a fresh gambling scandal of Hubert's had compelled their owner to part with. She knew that Raymond de Chelles had told the dealers he would sell his tapestries to any one but Mr. Elmer Moffatt or a buyer acting for him, and it amused her to think that, thanks to Elmer's astuteness, they were under her roof after all, and that Raymond and all his clan were by this time aware of it. These facts disposed her favorably toward her husband, and deepened the sense of well-being with which, according to her invariable habit, she walked up to the mirror above the mantelpiece and studied the image it reflected. She was still lost in this pleasing contemplation when her husband entered, looking stouter and redder than ever, in evening clothes that were a little too tight. His shirt-front was as glossy as his baldness, and in his buttonhole he wore the red ribbon bestowed on him for waiving his claim to a Velasquez that was wanted for the Louvre. He carried a newspaper in his hand, and stood looking about the room with a complacent eye. "Well, I guess this is all right," he said, and she answered briefly, "Don't forget you're to take down Madame de Follerive, and for goodness' sake don't call her Countess." "Why, she is one, ain't she?" he returned good-humoredly. "I wish you'd put that newspaper away," she continued. His habit of leaving old newspapers about the drawing-room annoyed her. "Oh, that reminds me." Instead of obeying her, he unfolded the paper. "I brought it in to show you something. Jim Driscoll's been appointed ambassador to England." "Jim Driscoll!" She caught up the paper and stared at the paragraph he pointed to. Jim Driscoll! That pitiful nonentity, with his stout, mistrustful, commonplace wife. It seemed extraordinary that the government should have hunted up such insignificant people. And immediately she had a great vague vision of the splendors they were going to, all the banquets and ceremonies and precedences. I shouldn't say she'd want to, with so few jewels. She dropped the paper and turned to her husband. If you had a spark of ambition, that's the kind of thing you'd try for. You could have got it just as easily as not. He laughed and thrust his thumbs in his waistcoat armholes with the gesture she disliked.
As it happens, it's about the one thing I couldn't.
You couldn't? Why not?
Because you're divorced. They won't have divorced ambassadresses.
They won't? Why not, I'd like to know.
Well, I guess the court ladies are afraid there'd be too many pretty women in the embassies,
He answered jocularly. She burst into an angry laugh, and the blood flamed up into her face. I never heard of anything so insulting, she cried, as if the rule had been invented to humiliate her. There was a noise of motors backing and advancing in the court, and she heard the first voices on the stairs. She turned to give herself a last look in the glass, saw the blaze of her rubies, the glitter of her hair, and remembered the brilliant names on her list. But under all the dazzle, a tiny black cloud remained. She had learned that there was something she could never get, something that neither beauty nor influence nor millions could ever buy for her. She could never be an ambassador's wife, and as she advanced to welcome her first guests, she said to herself that it was the one part she was really made for. End of Chapter 46. End of The Custom of the Country, by Edith Wharton. Read by Elizabeth Klett, in Houston, Texas, October 2013.